And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, you know, it's about to be writ again as I ask you to focus on sailors fighting in the dance hall. Is there life on Mars?
Mm-hmm.
The big question tonight is all about NASA as an intelligence agency and the deep history, the deep timeline, and of course, the repository of the largest information regarding the UFO file, all right in the heart of JFK's NASA. And we're going deep into the heart of Texas tonight. For that one, with a special episode, which is Dark Journalist X Series 206, it's NASA Secret Intelligence UFO File Revealed. And this is really interesting, actually, because on the heels of all the kind of traumatic events out of September, you've got this undercurrent, this underwave of other things that were going on. And they didn't receive as much coverage because of everything going on the surface with the Kirk assassination and all of the ramifications of that, which we did two major deep state episodes on that regarding it. We have more information coming forward about that, and there's been a lot of mainstream media silence and independent media manipulation and stuff around it. But one of the things I will say is the strongest, probably the most pronounced thing that came out of all that underneath the news headlines was about NASA. And there were two different stories, actually. One of them was, do you remember them saying that there was life on Mars a couple weeks ago?
Yes.
This is, I mean, this is the power punch that we've been waiting for from NASA probably since the 1950s, right? And now they just sort of glow that out there and say, well, there might be indications in this fossilized remain that this was part of an ocean bed that did have life, therefore it can support life, and so on and so forth. So the very first indications, etc. Now, something else that came up in that whole run in the same time period, and it's very interesting to note because this is the way Trump does things very often. And I have a few things. I have my free, advice to the Trump administration segment tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the interesting things that they had going on was this bit about making NASA an intelligence agency. Well, this is huge. If you've been following our kind of space intel series all the way from the secret space program coverage to the UFO file coverage to NASA to Lloyd Berkner, the International Geophysical Year, all of these pieces that we've been putting together, I have a feeling that because they're using transparency as their motto in the Trump administration, they have an issue, which is there are things that would be wide open because NASA knows them, especially in relation to these two missions that are coming up. Artemis in particular, which is the long threatened space program going back to the moon. Of course, they've been saying this and promising it for a long time. Maybe they will pull off Artemis, but it's already strange because it's flatlined for a good 5 years. But I think that what's going on there is they need now the cover of a direct proclamation that this is, in fact, an intelligence agency. So therefore, it's classified and all the information that NASA gathers is classified so that they can maintain, hey, we're being transparent, but this is classified. But it's an unusual move, make no mistake about it. NASA, although it came under the original umbrella under Eisenhower, who did not want it under the military. He wanted it as a civilian science space institute, and he wanted the Air Force to handle the military side. And Kennedy doubled down and tripled down on that, trying to get us to sign treaties about no weapons in space. And his incredible, peace in space speeches before the United Nations before his death, talking about joining in with the Soviet Union at the time and joining the Russians and going to the moon. So there's no space race and there's no arms race. And we're doing all these things like, arm in arm with these other nations. None of those people on that inside track who had been building up this completely other thing wanted anything to do with that. But we are the legacy of that here some 60 years later, the legacy of that assassination and the battle on the inside over aerospace, that exotic technology in the UFO file. And it's interesting because it's come out in so many different ways. There's been a lot of very unusual things in relation to aerospace, even through the 80s, the Challenger explosion. And, that's really the end of the dream of the Kennedy manned mission. If you think about it, under President Reagan, very suspicious, very unusual explosion. And, as far as I can tell in looking at some of the various things that have happened in that order, you can see a definite pattern of them and how they moved the space program more and more secret, more and more covert up, more and more black project, because they were working with a technology that they didn't want to share, one with the world and with other nations, and so on. We can go into the wisdom of that or not, because they were in a Cold War at the time. How do you explain it after the Cold War? And then you get into a whole question and answer thing in relation to that. How does that bring about any kind of world idea or world opinion around this? So we have to go into NASA in its original conception there back in 1958 on the heels of Sputnik, which is supposedly, we were caught by surprise. No, not at all. In fact, I mentioned physicist Lloyd Berkner back there, and he is the one who announced Sputnik to the New York Times when it happened. The American physicist announced it. So he got the intel before anyone else told us. And of course, Berkner is that fascinating character. We touch on him tonight, and you're going to be very surprised at how these figures interface with each other. Because when you look at Jack Parsons, JPL, after all, and Caltech, and that whole group that became the foundation of NASA and our rocket program, and all the occult underpinnings, well, it's been touched on in everything from his biographies to, they even did a television show. Remember Strange Angel and all that?
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't quite true to form in terms of his bio, by the way. But there's a lot of very, very key points there. And then there is the moon itself as an esoteric symbol and its esoteric impact and all the mystery schools and their knowledge and their teachings around the moon. So that's when you get Crowley involved with the early foundations of NASA through Parsons. That makes it into a true, you get kind of a better idea there, just like the Masonic element and symbolism of the Masonic Lodge on the moon. These things get us into a different territory. That's the territory that we need to be into in order to understand it. And then on the other side, to understand how NASA as an intelligence gathering entity is different than NASA, the spacefaring science, beacon out there, beacon of hope for humanity who's going to find life on Mars. Very, very different roles here. And how does this play out? This is the fight that's going on in the background. And I'll tell you, the tension on the surface and all the things that they talk about, the things that they're driving with the divisions and everything else, that space and aeronautics, aerospace piece is what's missing from the considerations in most people's minds, is they don't see that battle going on the geopolitical side. That's where dark journalism can really change the conversation here. But, the information that comes forward on that, we have to get that one. And it's going to be crucial. I'm going to show you how we can do that tonight. I want to remind you all as well that we'll be taking your questions in the second half of the program. Miss Olivia is putting those together now. You can ask them at any time during the show here, but we're still going to do them in the second half. We'll go a couple hours with you here tonight. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Jessica Rodriguez says, let's see what new intelligence we can learn tonight. Thanks to DJ and Miss Olivia. I always learn something new every week and connect more dots with every show.
That's great. Well, I'll tell you this. Thank you, Jessica. I will say this, that tonight we'll go back before Christ and we'll also jump ahead into the future. So we're going to swing wildly there on the timeline. And then there's a very interesting period between the 1920s and the current era with a specific impact on that era of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that really ramp all this up so we can understand it, because we stopped really tracking with what went on behind the scenes after the Kennedy assassination in terms of the space program. We have all these other things that come up that we are fed as the regular story. And of course, the moon landing is all part of that as well. And wherever you stand on the moon part, for sure, after the moon landings and after the piece of the space program after Apollo 11 and everything, we go into a strange period because in 1972, the manned missions to the moon stop. Now, I emphasize at this point a lot. Here's the key. It's 53 years later for us not to have ever gone back. And now they just talk about, oh, we have to beat the Chinese to the moon. It's ridiculous. Supposedly, we were there in 1969. So we already beat everybody, right? So therefore, how can you be in a race? It's a race to get back because it took the other nations 53 years. By the way, what about their programs? Where's the Russian version of going to the moon? 53 years and they never did it? I mean, strikes me as a little bit unusual. So there's a battle going on in the background there about the technology, and the technology that was used to get us into space in the first place wasn't as easy a suggestion as we initially thought. And the UFO file plays into this heavily. I'm going to show you how tonight. I'm going to show you through a very mysterious figure as well, who is palling around with our friend Parsons and got him positioned where he needed to be. And that is Frank Molina. It's also very interesting because that whole Aerojet group in the aerospace piece from the 1940s, they played a much bigger role in everything that happened afterwards, but by and large were forgotten, killed off, or dismissed. And that's an important part of the story because we have to understand how things were set up and the groups and the organizations. And so when you see Thelema right in the middle of all this, and when you see Jack Parsons going to meet with Kenneth Arnold after his famous UFO sighting and saying UFOs will be spread, Crowleyism will be spread through the UFO thing. This is a very interesting response, I would say. And this gives us some foundations on the UFO side around the mystical edge, which we really need. What do you got there?
Are we going to talk about 3i Atlas tonight?
Well, we've been covering 3i Atlas, and of course, it's in the mix for sure. Yeah, of course, it's this menacing comet that's heading towards the Earth, and
if it is a comet,
Avi Loeb back there in August said, "Oh, forget it. It's an alien spaceship, and you know what? It's going to be AI, and it's going to ask for an answer from humanity, and all this stuff." Loeb, I've pointed out before, is right over here at the Harvard Astrophysics Lab. And he comes directly out of Talpiot, which is Israeli intelligence. And although he's still a relatively young man, he worked on Star Wars, the original Ronald Reagan space defense plan, which now is being reorganized by President Trump as the Golden Dome defense grid. Well, what's missing is the parentheses there, which is the UFO defense grid. This is the part that we need to connect those dots. And I'm going to read a little bit from NASA's press release around two different things, and also on President Trump's very interesting and very unusual executive order now pinning that NASA is going to be an intelligence agency. So like the NGA, like the NRO, like the CIA and the NSA and the others, it is going to be, and of course it always has been, but now this gives it that official umbrella so they can say, hey, we're being transparent, right? The story itself grabbed me, and I will say this, that with all the big headlines that were going on with Kirk and with the Gaza situation and with, the Ukraine thing, I mean, a lot of things have really ground this out and kept it under the surface. But I will tell you that these NASA moves are dramatic if we relate it to the UFO file and we relate it to the things that we've been covering here, that intense crisscross of the geopolitical scene with this very, very important exotic technology. That has to be factored in order for us to get some sort of regular view of what's actually happening. And then we need the wide angle lens of what has taken place to understand and see through the people at the top to see where they're headed and where they're going. And not to just be cynical about it, but if we can get a handle on it, and they're going a place that we don't want them to go, there are solutions embedded in our system that can help us to, deflect some of that. You might have noticed there was a big kerfuffle over the leadership of NASA, and that caused the Trump and Elon Musk falling out, which was rather dramatic, actually. It got to the point where, Musk was saying that Trump went to Epstein Island and all these other things, which were not true. But Musk did not want to be on the losing end of that equation, and he pulled out his ultimate, I'm going to get Trump thing. And so that was very, very unfortunate. But what I will say in relation to Musk is he wanted that power because the NASA piece is still huge in all this. And if you're SpaceX, you're a private company, and they've privatized most of space. But technically, NASA is part of the public sphere. It's part of the government. So if you can get your guy installed there and then, have that kind of symbiosis going on, that's what Musk was looking for. And that's what Trump did not give him, to his credit in that case, especially since the person that he recommended was not up for that job at all. A big DARPA guy. All right. Trump executive order quietly declared that NASA is now a space agency. I want to read a couple of things from that Federal Labor Relations Management Program executive order of President Trump. This is from August 28th, but it started to hit the headlines in September. People started to finally realize, aha. By the authority vested in me as president, by the Constitution, by the laws of the United States of America, to enhance national security of the United States, it's hereby ordered, Section 1, the determination. The agencies and agency subdivisions set forth in Section 2 of this order are hereby determined to have as a primary function intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work. It is also hereby determined that Chapter 71, Title 5 of the United States Code cannot be applied to these agencies and agency subdivisions in a manner consistent with national security requirements and considerations. That is, you can't get them before Congress and say, you have to tell us what you have on this. So, for example, in the case of the UFO file, you're not going to be able to do that. Section 2, National Security Exclusions, Executive Order 12171, all the way back on November 19th, 1979. Note the year that Trump is citing here in this new executive order. As amended, is further amended by saying, quote, in Section 1-408, adding at the end, units in the Bureau of Reclamation with primary responsibility for operating, managing, and maintaining hydropower facilities. International Trade Administration, Department of Commerce, and then subdivisions of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then he goes into these various agencies, and boom, sitting in the middle of all that, add to the following this, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So now NASA comes under that umbrella of agencies that have this cover. Now, there's more in there, but that gives us the gist. What it does is it says, well, look, first of all, I've noted before that's very unusual that in the case, well, not so unusual, I guess, but in the case of Elon Musk, where he won't talk about UFOs or say that they exist and all the rest of it. Now, SpaceX is the second largest repository for UFO information in terms of video, photos, witness encounters, and all the rest. But as it turns out, who's number one? It's NASA. NASA's been up there with the satellites. They've been up there with the information collection. They've been up there with the surveillance. They know everything that's going on there. They've got the best and the most technical, and the best sensors as well. They have the number one repository. SpaceX is number two. Other groups that interact with all that, people like the NGA and the NRO, they come to NASA and field from the different sensors and the different cameras that they have. They go through that intelligence, farm it back out, and say, yeah, we had this wave of UFOs come in. They were coming in from this direction. It seems like they keep going under the ocean and back, or they keep heading over here. We see a large, heavy concentration in North America, down by Argentina, Antarctica. This is the type of things that they would track. We can understand what they're getting at, which is that's their intelligence profile. Now, NASA, under this new umbrella, doesn't have to share any of those interactions. So things are going to come up about what they've seen. And if they get squeezed on it, they're going to have this coverage of, well, it's national security and we're an intelligence agency. You can't pull that out of us. So it's a dramatic shift. But we're going to also see what they've been holding in the background there. Also, they have this, new exploration of the UFO file going on at NASA, incredibly underfunded. Like everything at NASA is underfunded right now. It's almost like a shadow organization compared to what it used to be. This dynamic driver, with even back in the Kennedy era, driving an immense part of the budgets. And by the time you got to the moon landing and all the rest of it, they actually had already paid for missions all the way through to the early 80s. So they already had the equipment and all the rest of it. Very often you will hear space historians and people of this ilk say, well, they didn't want to spend the money, and all the rest. All you have to do is check the most minor detail. They'd already paid for the stuff. They'd already built it in many cases. So the money was already allocated. That's not the reason. So what about the Mars mission that was set up? I'm going to read you some quotes tonight about the Mars mission from two different astronauts. And the whole piece around this is that we were set to go to Mars in the 1960s. And the follow-up for that was a Moon-Mars mission for 1981. So why are we some 40 some odd years later, we've never heard about any of that? You see, we're getting into a very shadowy area. That's on the official declaration side. In the background, we have the formative foundations of the whole thing. That gets us into the esoteric piece. So the moves at the top by President Trump on this, the fact that he declared the Space Force in the first place means there's an effort there to pull that UFO file directly under the executive branch. Because right now it has moved out to organizations like Lockheed, other defense contractors like Boeing, and one that shows up tonight in the spotlight, which is Northrop Grumman. And Jack Northrop, who was the top man at Northrop Grumman, and how he, when he got out of the organization and retired, started to talk about the UFO file.
Of course.
Of course. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X-Series 206. We'll be taking your questions tonight in the second half of the program. It's NASA Secret Intelligence UFO file. Yes, President Trump has announced through executive order that NASA is now an intelligence collection agency. This is different. This is definitely different, and there are reasons for it. We're going to go through it tonight. I want to remind you before we go any further to, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's free newsletter, but it keeps you in touch and us around the incredible censorship wave that we've seen. And I don't see it lightening up. They made all those announcements that YouTube was letting all these people back on YouTube, like Alex Jones and stuff like that. And then it didn't happen. And then they let out another announcement saying, well, actually, we didn't mean that exactly. We meant that there were going to be some that we would take a look at, so however they want to do that. And that is the nature of the social media sphere. What's funny is I find they have less and less of a need to censor as obfuscate, because what they've been able to do now is plug so many different types of astroturfing organizations in driving those news cycles, driving the algorithm and all the rest of it, that they're not as concerned. But they still, they have this wall of secrecy in place, and we run into it over and over again. But we get around it. And one of the best ways to get around it is that direct link with the newsletter. It's free. It'll let you know about the exciting docuseries we have coming up. And I thought this was really funny. We have a great one going on right now, which is the Craze in the Hot Zone. We just did Pyramid X, which is all about the incredible discoveries that will validate the work of the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce about Gaza and Giza, the Giza Plateau there being a much, much older structure, and that going back some 10,500 years BC. So get some of those figures going. And of course, JFK and the UFO file. Those are such deep explorations in those documentaries. And the most recent one we did there was JFK, the final speech. We have new ones coming up for you as well. That's all in the docuseries. And someone suggested out there, they were like, can you call it the Dark-U-Series?
That's very clever.
So we need that person for our marketing manager pronto, right? Thank you for the suggestion. I will definitely consider it. But in fact, they are dark journalism. And for me, they're just getting to the point of we need to have that vision there consolidated into these specials. So they're like 90-minute specials, and they've been getting a great response. So more of those are coming out. You'll hear about it first in the newsletter. Exciting interviews like you won't believe. We have incredible interviews coming up. I'm doing some next week. So just off the charts. And of course, your favorite guests, and also mind-blowing X-Series episodes, events, documentaries. It's all there. Make sure you go to darkjournalist.com. Okay, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Amarillo Gunrunner says, do SpaceX employees have to sign non-disclosure agreements? I would assume so.
No question. Yeah, and the thing is, because SpaceX works so closely with DARPA, I'm sure it's beyond just, corporate stuff. It's probably military as well. And remember, the whole Hot Zone series came about as the result of whistleblowers coming to me and saying, yeah, I know a lot about what you're talking about there in the Bahamas and Bimini region with in relation to the Cayce work, because I worked for this company, and when we were mining the floor and measuring the sea floor around there, we were told if you saw things like, the Temple of Isis down there close to Cat Key or something like that, no, you can't say anything about it. And if you're a military person and you do that, you can get court-martialed. So the craze in the Hot Zone is real. There's a lot of geopolitical force around keeping those ruins and that history secret. There's no question about it. That's what we've tried to put forward. And, I know all the Epstein stuff came out, and Ghislaine was up for, this kind of immunity and all these things. I will tell you that Epstein and Maxwell are both deep, deep in that Hot Zone specials. And if you want to know some of the other motivations involved there, including the fact of things we've put on the record about why Alexandra Cousteau was involved and why they were trying to get blackmailable, compromised data on her, she was the one that stood out for me the most, because it was the late Virginia Giuffre who put her on the map in her testimony against Prince Andrew. And I was amazed. I said, I understand what they're doing with Marvin Minsky and all the rest of it. And of course, then I put the dots together about Marvin Minsky and the daughter of Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken. No, I'm not kidding. And of course, we've done the episodes for the Hot Zone. That is the Colonel in the Hot Zone, but it's all there. And it shows you that the daughter of Colonel Sanders was the best friend of Marvin Minsky. Well, what was the daughter of Colonel Sanders doing? She was heading up the most intensive drive through the Bahamas for the ruins of Atlantis. So you see how these things work. If you can go into that deep place, then you start to see the movements around the geopolitics a little differently than just, hey, we're bombing drug running flotillas coming from Venezuela. Well, it's kind of a way to control that corridor, if you think about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, before I jump into this section, I'm going to ask you, Miss Olivia, what else you got out there?
Okay, let's circle back to Three Eye Atlas. So Jessica Rodriguez wants to know, is the Three Eye Atlas the false alien invasion that we've been warned about for decades? It just seems to be odd timing with all the UFO hearings and now a comet/alien mothership.
Yeah, well, my position on the UFO hearings, as you know, if you've been watching this show, is that they took a tremendous opportunity and frittered it away. And that is the whole task force that Luna is running. And instead, the voices that you have elevated out there are people like Avi Loeb, the scientist, and the things that he's saying are proven at all, but he's given an incredible megaphone on this. And then you have the people around it because he's perpetuating what? He's perpetuating the UFO threat. And the UFO threat is the central jewel in the crown of the intel approach to aerospace and the emergency powers aspect. You have to make sure you consider that when you're dealing with these people, because they've been driving it and they drove it through figures that we've exposed on this program, like Elizondo and Chris Mellon and others. You know, that track and that investigatory process that we opened up through our reporting. And there are still people who just, you know, they're brainwashed with that stuff, and they think that they're getting the real thing there through the CIA disclosure. There's no way. And so Loeb, when he got in with Galileo over here, his lab is like, you know, a few minutes from here. So he's in this mix over here, and what he's doing is, when he set up Galileo, they were getting all this funding and incredible, you know, crew, and he's like, I'm going to build this great crew of scientists. And when I first heard about him, I was thinking, this is interesting, because here we have this scientist who's come through, you know, all of these different programs, and he is very interested in UFOs, but he immediately started setting up intelligence people as his staff, including Mellon and other people. So he was directly controlled and working with those people. He was looking for the threat with Oumuamua recently. That was, you know, back, what, 2018, 2019, something like that. And that was their dry run on this. So now they have this Three Eye Atlas. We did 2 reports on it. I did one report on the Alex Jones show about it. And Alex had some interesting things to say on that as well. But what I will say is, his instant going to, this is a threat, and, you know, this is an intelligently controlled craft. And then the closer it got, you know, we started to see there's a comet tail, and it might be an unusual comet, but to suggest, again, what they think it is, what they're proclaiming that it is, that it's this, you know, enemy alien ship approaching Earth, is to get more information and data mining around how the public would respond to a genuine UFO threat, you see, because when they stage the fake thing, they want to be able to pull it off correctly. So they want to see how you would respond. And so having the scientific guy out there as the lead face was pretty good. They pulled back Elizondo pretty heavily, starting with his holding up the phony UFO picture. And Elizondo was the lead person around the UFO threat, you know, imminent and all that stuff. But I still hear, with the movie that's coming out next May with Spielberg, that at the very heart of it, again, is Elizondo, which is very, very disappointing. But they have all kinds of things. Obama is putting out the Betty and Barney Hill miniseries on Netflix and all the rest. So there's a lot of moves there in the background to co-opt what the public already knows about this. That's why there's a huge battle going on there. So you have culture wars, yes, on the surface in America, in other places. But behind the scenes, there's this thing. And that's where I think we can help give us some focus. Okay. The moon.
The moon.
The moon. What does the moon make you think of?
My my sun sign. That's immediately where I go.
Oh, yeah, yeah. There's that fantastic tarot card of the moon and all of these sea creatures coming out. And there's actually, in the Thoth deck, there is a really interesting image, and I will show it later, but it gives us that esoteric underpinning behind what the moon represents. Of course, the, you know, Russian philosopher George Gurdjieff, he said that it's understood in the mystery schools that humanity is food for the moon, as he put it. And this is still one of his greatest quotes, but what he was trying to get at was we're under a certain amount of mechanization. Wars are going to happen at a certain time, no matter what. And there were a number of things, accidents will take place at a certain time, no matter what. There's a certain no matter what, and then there's a certain amount of free will. That's the way he was describing it. So he was saying that the more aware a person became, the less and less they come under the laws that govern these things. And the moon is the most restrictive of all, according to him. I think that he said that the moon was under 48 different laws. Life on Earth is 24, but this maximum kind of automation and people living in sleep and living these very automatic, mechanical lives and all the rest of it. All of that is so rich in the Gurdjieff tradition. But what was he getting at? What were people like Crowley, who, again, through the back door, were very instrumental in setting up NASA in the first place? Why were they so concerned with the moon? Well, any good esotericist will tell you the moon is an incredibly powerful aspect of humanity. And in the work of Rudolf Steiner, we have the moon as a major force, and it kind of, it holds back a number of these darker forces that are in the cosmos, and it's kind of a protector in that sense. But it's got this mystical underpinning and needs to be understood and worked with in a certain way. And then you have the totally kind of physical ramifications, the control of the tides, this overwhelming power that the moon has on civilization. But certainly it has conjured our imagination for years and years. By the time we got around to the 20th century and the possibility of actually going there, then you can see we're at this incredible crisscross for humanity. And you can see where a lot of the secrecy grew up out of, and a lot of the storytelling and a lot of the obfuscation grew up out of this fact that the nations of the earth in the 20th century, with their wars and everything else, were hardly united. So the goal of some of the deep people, the people I call X-share inside the government, they are much more oriented towards bringing humanity together with a singular vision and, going to the moon together. These things that the X-share people, the idea was we're going to take the culture and move it forward. We're going to have things that will happen on a group level that will raise the consciousness of the planet. That really does exist. On the other side are the centralizers, and they have a different idea of oneness, which is humanity under one whip. So you have to get the difference there, that there's a oneness that's good, and then there's the New World Order or centralization, and that's not so good. It's very interesting to note that one of the early people who set up NASA, President Eisenhower, was not in favor of a moon mission. Isn't that interesting?
Was that for economic reasons?
This is one of these quotes I have. That's a good one. Of them was economic, but he thought it was a misallocation of humanity's attention. Enthusiasm for the Apollo, Kennedy was exactly the opposite. Enthusiasm for the Apollo program waxed and waned, and when people couldn't see the value in it, they dubbed it a moondoggle. The race to the moon was so unpopular at one point, President Eisenhower called JFK nuts. We have to remember that. And yet JFK pulled it off because he put it on the record. And he said, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Here's what President Kennedy said May 25th, 1961, in relation to NASA and the moon. And it was after he installed James Webb as the NASA administrator. Of course, the famous James Webb Space Telescope and all those things are named after him. Webb was a very high Mason as well. So the mystical thing, instantly, when you get involved with NASA, it seems like the Masonic piece is there. And some great researchers, guys like Hoagland and stuff, have brought out that occult aspect is there. The Mason aspect is there. Like, they just are undeniable streams when you get around the space thing. There's a reason for that. That goes far beyond just power differential. This is mystical You're going right to the core. So here's what President Kennedy had to say. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. So, do you see the honesty there? He's saying, look, this is going to cost some serious, serious money, and I'm not going to hold back about it. Kennedy gave his We Choose to Go to the Moon speech the next year on September 12th, 1962, at Rice University, where he addressed the nation, hoping to reinforce public support for the Apollo program, despite attacks on the goal of landing astronauts on the moon from the former president, Dwight Eisenhower, and, of course, Barry Goldwater and others. They were all going after them. Now, it's very interesting because apparently their timelines were very different. But one of the things that Kennedy was trying to do was force the timeline, because then you could force open. He already saw the program, which was blue, which we put on the record, and then the government admitted to. And if you follow this program, you know all about that story. So in March of 2023, I put forward information about the secret space program and a program that Kennedy had tried to open up in relation to the UFO file called Blue. And when I did that, a number of counterintelligence people approached me, and they sent me messages just talking back and forth. And it was quite interesting because one of the things they said was, where'd you get the name? How'd you know the name? So the name I had gotten through deep research. And the Blue program encompassed all of our efforts around interacting with the UFO file in relation to our own space exploration. And so all the programs from Blue Book and everything else had that identifier in there, just like whenever you got around this, blue was the hardcore piece. So what happened in early 2024 is we really got this going at a certain point. Like the blue thing was starting to pick up, and they must have thought to themselves, well, we already have someone out there talking about blue. Let's do this. And they rolled out Kona Blue and said, yeah, it was actually a program about crash retrievals and, recovering alien technology and all the rest. But you know what? Kona Blue never accomplished anything because there were no UFOs to recover. See how easy that is? So they got out of the whole blue thing. Later, it's very interesting because our old friends at the Wall Street Journal, they did an interesting thing, which is they claimed all of a sudden that the UFO file wasn't real. They tried to put the whole thing back in the genie bottle, and they could not do it. But one of the things that they tried to do was say that the people who were coming forward and saying, oh, I've seen this UFO file or that UFO file when I was in the government and I'm a whistleblower, were actually just being hazed when they got in there and shown materials to see if they would do it. The name of that program, according to the Wall Street Journal, was Yankee Blue. Now, you can see, again, these trails where they try to block things off. The secrecy group is still active and still thinks that's a better way to go. The larger portion of the intelligence agencies is going in a different direction. What they're saying is, no, we can co-opt the thing. We'll go along and we'll say it's a threat, and then we'll be gold. We'll have the UFO Defense Office, et cetera. But there are still people nervous in that setup about that. So the New York Times, Elizondo, CIA piece, that's one piece. The secrecy group, trying to put it back in the bottle, have a much tougher job. And this is where the showdown is. But there again, Yankee Blue, right in the heart of it. Now, I will say that other people, came forward with these big proclamations, and guys like Michael Schellenberger and stuff were snowballed. These were journalists who were out there, and Intel people called them up and said, I have a big story for you. There's a program called Immaculate Constellation, and you're going to be the one to reveal it before Congress, buddy. You're all set. And they roll these people out. They have them sitting next to Elizondo, and you have Nancy Mace up there asking them questions, but she doesn't know anything about the program, so she can't ask them anything. It's all misleading. And where does it go? That story, which they put behind paywalls and did all this stuff, nothing. Immaculate Constellation. Have you heard anything about it? It's absolute zero of the story. So you can see, look at the difference between Blue and Immaculate Constellation, just on the record. You can see that the blue thing is real. because they had to produce it because we already put it out. Immaculate Constellation was something they gave to Schellenberger and created a little mythos around so that, guys like Corbell could have a podcast about it and, be towing the party line on that. So it's a very interesting, it's the haunt of disinformation tactics, hardcore. And so when you get around NASA and this intelligence agency piece, you can see they're guarding a deep secret in relation to this. And it was Musk who, in his early maneuvers to get his friend in there, he was trying to get ahead of that process and be like, if I can merge the database of NASA in with what I'm doing, I'll be unstoppable. And he's still under a gag order from DARPA where he can't talk about UFOs, because if you're up there and you talk about UFOs and you don't toe the party line, forget it. You're out. Because if you want to do business in space, you got to answer to the man, baby. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 206. It's NASA Secret Intelligence UFO File. Wow, there's been so many things to catch up on here. Just incredible. Let's get into an unusual series of events that took place in 1978 and culminated in a military takeover of a tiny island in 1983, shall we? That is the island of Grenada. Before I do it, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I want to hear about Grenada.
What else you got?
David Lower Dash says, why was JFK so hell-bent on it when it was insanely expensive? And Scarmoge says, moon mission, lots of money laundering and black project funding, unless they decide to tell us how they really went to the moon and show us the technology.
Well, Kennedy was an incredible visionary. And I mean, if you study his work, he understood things. He had a long-range vision. One of the things that the Russian leader, Gorbachev, had to say about Kennedy, and of course he came much, years later, 20 years later, but he said I think this was 2011, the quote comes from, he said, President Kennedy was so far ahead in his thinking that we're only now catching up to him. Kennedy had that vision. He understood. He looked at it from a number of different angles. He understood the war people. They were always trying to get him into wars in Vietnam, Cuba, with the Russians, Central America, Africa, the Congo, forget it. The intelligence agencies were running paramilitary groups everywhere. That was their solution. Take it over, move your troops in, do it. Move it in through the Central Intelligence Agency, overthrow people, install our people. This is what they were doing all over the world. So Kennedy gets in and he says to his aide, Arthur Schlesinger, I can't believe, and this is somebody who was really in the know. He knew a great deal about intelligence work. He said, I cannot believe the amount of power the Central Intelligence Agency has over our foreign policy. So he understood this was the central problem. But what's not understood, we understand something about the space age in relation to Kennedy, and that he wanted to go to the moon, and that he felt like, if this is something if we throw our hat over the fence there about going to the moon before the decade was over, this would unite the culture to really go for it and give us a vision of the new frontier. This is where Kennedy was coming from. But Kennedy also understood deep aspects about the space program, the UFO file, the exotic technology, and the fact that you had a split there that was trying to militarize space. In fact, before Kennedy got in, there was the whole nuke the moon thing to see what happens. So there were a number of things, and he saw how dangerous that was. He also saw humanity. After all, he had been a veteran in World War II, and he saw what war did to the world. So he understood you can have perpetual war, or you can try to arrive at some kind of peace. And the way to do it was to take a place like space, which was still a new frontier, and say, no weapons. No weapons. This is an incredible concept. And only scientific exploration. Absolutely bold. And wanting to do that with your biggest enemy and saying, I will give you access to even our secret UFO files if we do this together. So this is a huge chapter of history that's missing. And I think we understand him as his peaceful overtures, but the space part is not deeply because the UFO part was so hidden in his era that there isn't a trail of documents where historians could sit there and go through it and be like, well, this is what they thought of the UFO file. No, it was all off paper. It was all off the record. It was all deep, deep, heavy duty secrecy. And that's where you got some of the most major problems in government, period. So, long story short, in relation to Kennedy around this, he was the visionary who understood that space was going to be crucial for humanity's future. And we'll see tonight, he was absolutely correct. I have some very interesting quotes as well, I think tonight, that are going to capture the reasons why he was so hell bent on keeping weapons out of space. But let's go to 1978. We're in 1978, everybody. And Close Encounters of the Third Kind has just come out last year and won Academy Awards. Steven Spielberg is giving a light show there at the UN. President Carter is in office. President Carter famously, before he got into office, said, I will do everything I can to get the information about the UFO file out. And confessed the fact that he actually had seen UFO himself when he was governor of Georgia in 1969. Now, it's a very interesting sideline. You can take this for what it's worth, but I think I've mentioned before this group in Canada that was channeled through an individual, the late Rick Thurston. I spent some time with him, and I asked him about Carter, and he said what Carter didn't remember is he and that whole group were abducted and had spent time aboard a craft.
Wait. Reverse.
Yes.
What did you just say?
Well, remember Rick Thurston?
Yes.
Dear
He
Rick.
said that Carter
Yes.
had been abducted in 1969?
Yes.
With how many people?
The group that was there. I don't know how many, maybe 6 people. Yeah.
Okay.
And that gave him this kind of overriding understanding concern about it. And it's very interesting because Shirley MacLaine, of all people, tells this fascinating story about Jimmy Carter and getting a call. He's long out of office, the late president now, but he was long out of office. And she gets this call around 2005. And it says, oh, this is, an aide for President Carter's library. He wants to come down and arrange a meeting with you. He'll fly you down, have a lovely dinner, and he has some questions to discuss. So she gets there, and they talk, and they have all these little niceties and stuff. And then at dinner, she says, okay, what am I really doing here? And he says, I want to know what they're doing. What are they doing here? And she said, you mean the aliens? And he said, yeah, what are they doing here? And she said, well, I'll put it to you this way. They're trying to convey the idea that since there's reincarnation, the idea of wars is ridiculous because people will just die and reincarnate over and over again. So that'll end wars very fast. This is kind of her quick response to the whole thing. But hardcore, born again Carter missed the UFO conversation with her because he got hung up on the reincarnation question, and their conversation ended there. But he called her down, and I actually know someone else who knew a psychic that Carter was consulting around the very same piece. Very interesting. When I spoke to Paul Hellyer, who was the former defense minister of Canada, he came on this program. We have a show all the way back, I don't know how many years. This is like 2016.
A long time ago.
And he was a fantastic, fantastic man, very active in his 90s, and told me point blank that the same people who were behind the financial problems in the world generally, the central bank cabal, as it were the same people behind the UFO secrecy effort. And I actually I have a headline from him from that era. But I think we have to wrap our heads around the fact that a lot of people in these situations are aware of the UFO factor in relation to world problems and have tried to, come into this. Now, it's funny, somebody like Carter would go to Shirley MacLaine, you might think, and yet Shirley MacLaine has an incredible background as an actress, as an author.
As a political activist.
As a political activist, yeah, absolutely. All the way back to the 1970s. and that, her acting career's 60s.
No,
Maybe
she started in the 50s.
what is that Alfred Hitchcock movie?
Trouble with Harry.
She is great.
Mhm.
She's great in that. What year is that? Is that like
That's in the 50s.
someone can tell us what year that is? All right, so keep all that in mind. This is the Jimmy Carter we're talking about. The same Jimmy Carter who demanded of his then CIA director, George H.W. Bush, that he wanted the UFO files on X, 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 and X. And Bush said no. No, as you may know, the president, those files are for need to know. And the president in this case doesn't have a need to know. If it comes up in the future, then maybe we'll share it with you. And Carter fired him and put in Stansfield Turner. And I mentioned that in relation to the current era because I see it as a real mirror reflection of what's going on with people like Patel and Tulsi Gabbard and stuff, and Trump's CIA director. I think they are viewed as outsiders by those agencies, and so they're blocked from a number of things. So we'll see how far he's able to get around this. So what we have is an individual politician running Caribbean island of Grenada, and his name is Eric Gary, and he has a very interesting history that connects him with groups and names of groups that seem to be CIA. For example, the group that got him into power is named Mongoose. And of course, Operation Mongoose was the name of the CIA program to overthrow Castro back in the day under the Kennedy administration. Kennedy thought this is out of hand, get rid of those people. And they ran this CIA station in Miami and used the pull of that station to cover up the crime of the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating our president. So there was a very strange history about him, and also the fact that the person who replaced him name was Maurice Bishop, which is the famous alias of E. Howard Hunt. And so this is I'm sorry, David Atlee Phillips. So and Atlee Phillips, of course, that came up because Antonio Vecchiana, who was this, anti-Cuban activist and was really hardcore in Alpha 66. These were the groups that America was sending into Cuba to overthrow Castro. And Vecchiana, came out during the 1970s and said David Atlee Phillips called himself Maurice Bishop, and he had me working with people like Oswald and all these other people, and the idea was to take down Castro. Now, he'd seen basically Phillips prepping Lee Harvey Oswald. And he got shot. Vecchiana got shot, and he survived. But then he didn't want to talk about anything. Finally, in the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination, he comes out and he says, just so you know, for the record, and he sends it to the widow of this JFK researcher named Gaetan Fonzi. He says, for the record, the person that I knew as Maurice Bishop was David Atlee Phillips, and I saw him with Lee Harvey Oswald in September 1963 in Dallas. And after all, Phillips was from Fort Worth, and there's the famous story that Phillips, in the 1980s, is dying of lung cancer, and his brother is always known that he was involved somehow in the Kennedy assassination. He calls him up in that hospital, and he says, I have to know, were you in Dallas that day? Were you involved in the assassination of President Kennedy? And Atlee Phillips says, oh, we don't want to talk about this. We're family and all the rest of it. And the brother says, no, you have to tell me. And he raises the pitch of his voice. And it's interesting because Atlee Phillips's nephew was there, present for the call, so he could recount it in detail. Finally, he screams his head off at him. It just says, tell me. And Phillips said, yeah, I was. I was. If it makes you, it gives you any peace or whatever to know, I was there. I was involved. So Phillips, his deathbed confession, there were all of these pieces around it. But there was the name again, Maurice Bishop, which is the name of the Grenada president who overthrows Eric Gary. I found all those name references just kind of interesting. But
It's
you know me and names. All right. Just to give you some idea, this guy put UFOs on such a bullseye, that is Eric Gary, the president of Grenada, that in 1978 he put out a series of stamps that were called Research into Unidentified Flying Objects. And these are the actual stamps that he put out. This is somebody who was deep into looking into this.
Those
So
are incredible.
Aren't they? Yeah. You want to see
Yeah.
them? Here, look at that. It's very, very interesting. And I mean, they're also giving us a real idea what this guy was into. And he thought we can really raise this. And he wanted to call 1978 World UFO Year. So this guy was hardcore into it. One of the things he was able to do, and I think it's extraordinary looking into this, he was able to organize not one, but two separate meetings about having a UFO wing of the UN set up in order to deal with this. And Gordon Cooper, the astronaut from the Gemini program, who we've quoted so deeply on this program because of his honesty and the things that he was put in there by President Kennedy at the very top. He was Kennedy's astronaut, the man who gave him the intel at NASA. And he worked closely with von Braun and others, so he was really hardcore in the know. But he organized these meetings, and you can see there in the background, that's J. Allen Hynek with the pipe, unmistakable man. And what happened was he was organizing these things, and it started to come down. He even got a meeting with Kurt Waldheim, and that's part of that meeting. And this Jacques Vallée is in there, Allen Hynek, Prime Minister Grenada. Apparently what happened was in 1977, there was a UFO crash in Grenada, and there was a crash on a beach, and this is the rendition of the crash of the ship that crashed. Very unusual.
Who did that
drawing
rendition?
It was just an artist that was associated with the sighting.
Okay.
And based on witness testimony. And it's weird because it has the Egyptian Ankh and all the rest. But one of the things that came about as a result of that, and what the president of Grenada told President Carter, is that inside was a being. And that the being was incredibly tall, 8 foot tall, and had eyes that were non-human, but otherwise looked kind of Nordic. And that...
How are the eyes different if they weren't human?
I just think that, it took ice blue to a new thing. They were larger, and they were just this incredible blue. And so what happens is, he says, well, what did you determine if the pilot was still alive? And they said, we don't know. It doesn't seem like it's human. And he says, well, put it in the St. John's Hospital. Put it in there. We'll have our people go over it in minute detail. And he does, in fact. Now, what's going to be interesting, I'm going to jump ahead in the story here. In 1983, when President Reagan invades the island of Grenada, the idea is that they're going to save these 50 students that are medical students from the U.S. from becoming a new Iranian hostage crisis, because they see there are Marxists who want to take over the island, and that Cuba is helping them to do this. Now, our friend here, Eric Gary, has already been ousted. And the person he was replaced with, this Maurice Bishop character, supposedly was somebody that the CIA was working with. So there's a lot of very, very strange moves here going on. But what's interesting is part of the siege of Grenada takes place at this hospital as well. So you have the strange story about a being being put in cold storage at this hospital in Grenada, and then here you go again. So there's something unusual about this, but let's go back to the setup. Eric Gary is coming to President Carter, and he's wanting all these initiatives, and Carter's very open to it. Carter is trying to create a new paradigm for the UFO file in America as well at that point. So you have, as I've cited, these two different UN meetings, and the idea is suddenly, here's actually Jacques Vallée speaking. So the president of Grenada has given him the speaking time to go ahead and make his pitch for the UFO file. That's 1978, a very young Jacques Vallée. Now, here are the news stories at the period of time. Opening of OAS meeting marked by UFO warning, and as the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States met Tuesday in the Western Hemisphere's smallest country amid water shortages, leaky roofs, and power failures, and heard its prime minister warn once again about the dangers of flying saucers. Eric Gary, Grenada's prime minister, opened the OAS meeting with a call for an international investigation into flying saucers. Gary, 55, said some persons consider irrelevant his crusade for investigation into UFOs, psychic phenomena, and the effects of the Bermuda Triangle.
Right on.
He's my kind of prime minister, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he said he is proud of his participation in an international conference on UFOs earlier this year, where he said scientists of the world asked him to continue his efforts on behalf of the extraterrestrial phenomena research. And a separate meeting again at the UN has him doing the whole "we need a new approach on UFOs" thing. And present here are the Prime Minister of Grenada, J. Allen Hynek, and some other luminaries from the period. So Gary's unusual, and he is ousted because I think, okay, they're worried about him. Now, there's UN chatter that this guy is getting way, way ahead of what they want to do. And they start to put out these memes about him basically saying, well, you know, he might not be playing with a full deck, and because his secrecy gauge is off, and they're trying to figure out who's operating him and bringing the UFO file to this core center at the UN. Now, in his meetings with President Carter, he is giving him this approach and saying, let's do the UFO year 1978, and Carter is all for it. Carter believes in Gary, and Carter confides to him that he's had this UFO sighting of his own. And Gary confides to him, he says, well, you know, I think that I've heard almost, you know, because of this crash and everything else, I think that I've heard almost the call of destiny by bringing this forward. And Carter says, well, I'll share something with you. I had an aunt who used to channel Christ. And she said this was an era for humanity to expand its understanding of its place in the universe and all the rest of it. So Carter's a little more unusual, I would say, than we've ever heard or been given credit for. And we're looking at somebody who maybe, you know, was interested in the UFO file, channeling, and other things, as demonstrated by his meeting with Shirley MacLaine. Now, there's a whole article here that I have. It's all about the invasion of Grenada a few years later and the reasons for it, etc. But I'll just read a couple of lines from it to give us the gist of what was going on with the invasion of Grenada. And I found it very interesting because one of the things that Trump was saying about Russia recently was that it was a paper tiger. Remember those?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that paper tiger reference comes up in Reagan's conversation about America not being perceived as a paper tiger, and that, you know, going into Grenada to show the Marxists and, you know, El Salvador and all the other things that it's not going to go this way. Reagan administration overriding reason for invading Grenada was to keep the United States from being perceived as a paper tiger in the eyes of both friendly and hostile Latin American nations, administration officials said today. We had a close, unambiguous, frantic request from everybody around Grenada to go in. And what do you do? One senior official said as he recalled the steps leading up to last Tuesday's invasion. If we said no, the official said, not only might there have been another Iran with American hostages and the students, who knows, but one would have taken us seriously anymore down there. What good are maneuvers and shows of force if you never use it? And so there was a whole very unusual thing. And of course, the proximity of the Caribbean and the stories I've had about the hot zone and all the things going on there. Grenada is one of those strange stories like the Falkland Islands stories, which is never quite resolved as to why it happened in the first place. The only thing I can tell you is the efforts of Gordon Cooper, who'd after all been to space, who was JFK's main guy in relation to NASA and feeding him the inside intel. The fact that he was joining forces with this prime minister and trying to get the UN to recognize this, and he wrote this incredibly eloquent speech for it. I'm going to quote Gordon Cooper here and what he had to say about the mission to Mars. And that's going to bring us all around to NASA again, because the entire effort around World UFO Year 1978, Eric Gary and all the rest of it, was to get NASA to be the lead on revealing the UFO file. Here was the 70s version of disclosure. It was right within their grasp. They just could not figure out, the groups that held that material, how to let go of that wall of secrecy and maintain their incredible advantage. And the blocks there against the efforts at transparency were phenomenal, as you can see in the island of Grenada. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, deep tonight on NASA's secret intelligence UFO file. I said it at the top of the program, NASA has been deemed an intelligence agency by an executive order of President Trump, who also set up the Space Force to pull back that UFO file knowledge back under the umbrella of the executive branch. We're going to take your questions coming up here shortly, I'd say within the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to present a little more, and then we'll hop it over to you. What do you got there, Miss Olivia?
Knifey says their main highway in Grenada is called Maurice Bishop Highway. Terry Doherty, there are some really interesting factoids here, says, I read an article decades ago with pictures of a body washed up on a Grenada beach, which looked amphibian. I never forgot about it. Deborah McAdoo. I know. I heard there are portals in Grenada, and that's what went on there and still does. And Karen Carpenter says, any truth to the rumors that the black goo was the reason for the war in Grenada, or is the black goo a smokescreen for the being?
Yeah, black goo is just one of those things that went around, and unfortunately, there wasn't any good scientific underpinning of the whole thing. I don't doubt that there are stories and witness testimony around strange things that happen like that. But unfortunately, none of it ever surfaced that was verifiable. But in terms of Grenada, absolutely. And the crash story, look, I don't see this prime minister making stuff up, you know. And if he is putting his leadership on the line at the UN, somebody is running that with him. The fact that Cooper joined forces with him, and Cooper was such a force himself at NASA previously, tells us that Cooper had thought this X-Protect group had gotten their hands on space secrecy, and he wanted to kind of pull it back for humanity's sake. That's what you have to read between the lines all the time with Cooper. He's over and over doing this, especially in relation to Mars and the mission to Mars that was going to happen. I'm going to read you an excerpt right now from Leap of Faith, which is Cooper's incredible autobiography. All right, note the dates here. Like we started off with NASA, the Kennedy period, going to the moon. So what he has to say is, of all the planets in the solar system, Mars, the fourth planet from the sun, was thought to be the only place other than Earth considered suitable for human habitation. The other planets were either too gaseous, too little solid surface, too windy, or too hot. Like Earth, Mars has two poles and gravity, about 38% of the Earth's gravity. And scientists consider Mars the closest planet to us in terms of what we might have been once, and agree that it's the first significant step in exploring the solar system, as well as finding how Earth was formed. Reaching the moon was found the more difficult, but the more promising goal of man landing on Mars has always been the dream of Wernher von Braun. Of course, he wrote Project to Mars and the Mars Project, two separate books, same title, and in there predicts that the person who'll lead the group that's on Mars will be named Elon. Remember that? 1964, NASA had announced and succeeded in making the world's first ever Mars flyby with Mariner 4. We all hoped it was a prelude to bigger things to come. But Mars was lost to our generation when the manned missions originally planned back in the mid 60s for a 1981 launch, which, as the youngest Mercury astronaut, I was in a good position to command, was canceled. It was killed largely on the behest, and he goes into the Senate budget thing, but we know what was really going on in the background. At the time the Mars program was killed, the spacecraft for the mission, about the size of the Apollo command module with the service module attached, was 90% designed. 90%. Ready to roll. We had also done a good percentage of the engineering for the flight, although it hadn't been decided whether 3 or 4 astronauts would make the trip. Importantly, we had the booster to take us there, the nuclear Nerva. It had been built and ground tested, but never flown in space for the Mars mission. The Saturn would have been used to get into the Earth orbit, where we would rendezvous with the nuclear Nerva engines and its tanks of fuel, and it would have been launched separately. The technology was in place to do this. The round trip to Mars would have taken little more than a year. So the great promise that he's talking about here that was meant to happen, the mission to Mars. Now, if you go through that book, what happens is in 1966, he gets a little tap on the shoulder from Werner von Braun, who he worked closely with, who said, get yourself in shape. You're leading the mission. And at the time, Cooper thinks they're going to do it within the next year. And when it doesn't happen, a little later, someone taps him on the shoulder and says, remember what you heard from von Braun about the mission? Forget he said it. Forget all about it. Don't even think about it. Don't mention it again. Don't call us, we'll call you. And so he gets so disheartened by this that he quits. He gets out of NASA, and he does some very interesting things in Central America with ruins and stuff, because I think he saw a great deal from being up there. Now, what happens is he hears rumors again that this thing is going to go off in 1981. Now, what I'm going to posit here is that we did the mission in 1981. This is the problem that we have with the space program going black in 1972. We don't know. But if it was set for 81, I don't see why they changed it. So keep that in mind as we go along here. Now I'm going to get into some of the occult aspects involved and how that's going to play into, what that setup was originally in any case. And we're going to introduce 2 very interesting characters into the mix. One of them is going to be Jack Northrop, and the other, Frank Molina, and how they relate to our friend Jack Parsons. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 206, NASA's secret intelligence UFO file, going deep tonight into the secret space aspects. That whole secret space piece requires secret space architecture. And, of course, we've been on the trail of the real secret space program. There's been a lot of noise around that over the years, but nonetheless, fundamentally, the questions remain, and they become more and more potent as we see things like NASA becoming now an intelligence agency. And when you see the largest private defense contractor in space, SpaceX, saying there are no UFOs, and Musk saying no, doesn't exist, then the lid has been clamped down tightly on the real thing while they run the phony CIA UFO threat trolls through congressional hearings and things like that and see if they can catch fire. And they're also measuring that response, as I've pointed out. I'm going to take us into a strange place, which is going to bring us to Quetzalcoatl.
Mm-hmm.
The Mayan god, Kukulkan. How does that play in here? Well, believe it or not, it does. It plays a very unusual place here, and it all works through these same individuals somehow. I want to remind you, before I go any further, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch for all the heavy-duty censorship that we experience here on this program. I've pointed out with a lot of subjects and things we put out there that get pirated and everything else, that, if it takes being a lone outpost on some of this work, then that's what we've signed up for. But it doesn't matter, because we're going to bring the truth forward, even in this podcast pop click world, which is doomed to constant disinformation and clickbait headlines and things like that. What they're really pushing and pulling the money in this kind of pseudo alternative media thing. It's not really independent media anymore. So we need a whole different wave of how to do this. And we're going to be pushing forward with the types of deep, potent reporting that is required for the period and the era that we're in. And you can be right on the front lines there just by being part of that newsletter. And so, if you haven't already, make sure you're signed up on that. Okay, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Twilight Mist said, true fact, the reason humans tend to have so many back issues over time is because the gravity levels on Mars are more compatible with our physical form than Earth's is.
Wouldn't that be something?
Fascinating. And Stephen K says, what about the NASA employees who claim there's a video of people in spacesuits walking around on Mars? Just liars?
Yeah, there's some interesting accounts like that. And we saw that thing that was going around recently where that astronaut comes up to the microphone and he's like, yeah, and we'll be going to the moon for the first time. Like, whoops, let that one out. Okay, so there was a very advanced craft in 1940, which was just called a flying wing. And it was put up by Northrop Grumman. And it was designed by this incredible visionary designer named Jack Northrop. And he'd been through Lockheed Martin. He'd been through Douglas Aircraft. And in some particular episode, I'll do a proper history on our friend. We don't have time in this one to do it. But let's just say that Northrop said some very interesting things toward the end of his life in relation to the UFO file. And I'm going to read some of them tonight. I want to do an incredible crisscross here with Northrop, Melina, Jack Parsons, and Kenneth Arnold. I'm going to try to accomplish all that in the next 8 minutes, and we're going to go to your questions. Here we go. That is a vision of his wing, by the way. And the Northrop YB-49, which became the XB-49, flying wing, a heavy bomber prototype, propped. And this is very interesting because it was the jet-propelled variant of the company's XB-35 bomber. And it's pretty interesting that for World War II, he put this on the map and he said, we have to do it this way. And in fact, most of his research and most of Northrop was forced under around the flying wing right about 1951. And it was forced under by a senator, someone who would be a future senator named Symington. And he was the head of the Air Force at that point. And he said, we'll go ahead with your X technology flying wing if and only if you merge right now with Converse. And he said, no way. And Symington said to Jack Northrop, well, I'm going to ruin you and your company. Symington is going to show up in a very unusual fashion later, vying to be Jack Kennedy's VP, oddly enough. And he'll land in a very interesting role as senator there, as a Democratic senator. But it will be his own nephew that becomes who runs the governorship of Phoenix during the Phoenix Lights. And that Symington and this Symington are directly connected.
Unbelievable.
That's just, I mean, what's in a name, right? What's in a name? Okay. By the way, the later version eventually developed. I mean, looks very much like a UFO. Can't be denied. Here's the original version of the prototype from the 1940s. I mean, look at this thing.
Wow.
Quite remarkable. Okay. Here's what Jack Northrop had to say on the flying wing's demise. And he said this in 1979. He was ill in health and advanced in years. But you can start to feel heaviness around the UFO file here. He alleged that Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington threatened him by saying, You'll be goddamn sorry if you don't. Symington later left the government to head the very same consolidated Vultee company Northrop had refused to merge with. Symington called the charge preposterous and absurd and told the researcher there was a tremendous overcapacity following World War II. And basically that's what happened. That, it wasn't him personally and none of this stuff. And yet the fact that he went and became CEO of the same company makes it seem like Northrop had him on here. Northrop, his health failing in 1976, felt compelled to communicate to NASA his belief in the low drag, high lift concept inherent in the flying wing. NASA replied that the idea had technological merit, encouraging Northrop and his flying wing concepts. Okay. So it takes place right around this period, which I'm going to read from, is an unusual conversation. Hang on just a second. And while I'm looking for this, Miss Olivia, why don't you give me something else?
I'll just throw the one that's looking at me right now.
Yeah.
The secret spaceship says, what do you know about the Nazis creating a UFO/Hanabu base in the jungles of South America?
Oh, yeah.
The Adamski is it Menger ship?
Oh, it's interesting. It's so funny. I'm so glad you asked that question because that's Menger. Yeah. But check this out. How do you like this? So I'm about to read you excerpts where Jack Northrop of Northrop Grumman talks all about UFOs. But what was the name, and of course the location as well, of George Adamski's Venusian alien? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
It was Orthon.
Mm-hmm.
And Orthon is just about an anagram of Northrop. Think about it. Isn't that interesting? I was like, because I always thought Orthon was a very odd, strange name, but boy, is that close. And here's what Jack Northrop has to say about UFOs in 1975. My interest began 23 years ago when I was active in aerospace. And in the industry, our chief test pilot, Max Stanley, had a tremendous amount of previous aircraft experience, was making a trip back from Albuquerque to Los Angeles, to Hawthorne, to our plant there. And he had two very knowledgeable observers. They saw a UFO that could not be explained by any of the techniques we knew then or now. And they were able to keep this object under observation for a period of about 20 minutes. And of course, people of that character, the chance of any hoax or any misleading statements absolutely just simply doesn't exist. These were our top technicians who had opportunity firsthand. Personally, I've never seen a UFO or had any contact with anyone other than Mr. Stanley, but I had complete and utter confidence in him. And I know what he reported was actually there. Well, starting with their interests, then it became a natural thing to read up and what I could on it, here, there, and everything that I heard. And my belief in the fact there are UFOs has been reinforced through the years. But what I've seen, I've read a great deal to believe that what occurred in 1950, about the size of it, well, it really seems like most UFOs move in very strange patterns. They're able to hover, almost standing still, and then zoom off. It seems as if they're utilizing some other form of energy that perhaps we don't know about now in terms of our present aerodynamic technology. Do you feel, the question was asked, do you feel we've utilized all the aircraft that we can? And so the question's a little bit wobbly. And it's thoroughly modern and up to date based on our present knowledge. There's absolutely no question in the world, but there is not only a source of power in which we're not aware of, but there is also a source of propulsion we're not acquainted with, because the UFOs seem to have unlimited power, which perhaps we could obtain if we developed the fusion power. And more or less, it goes on forever fishing that we're using whatever it is now that utilizes the elements of a certain extent, but fusion recreates this material. That's us. And we can use it. Perhaps a fusion of a small fusion power plant would give you the power necessary. But the propulsion of these UFOs is unique. Their ability to hover, their ability to accelerate, and they're rapidly their ability to move at very high speeds, much higher than anything that we've achieved, even with our supersonic aircraft. All of these things, particularly interesting about sonic booms and things that we don't like about our supersonic aircraft. All of this indicate a type of propulsion which is unique and different than anything we know anything about, and which would be of tremendous value if we could develop it and use it. That's the reason I feel, with a number of others who have studied it, that it is a subject which deserves the highest type of scientific study, and at the earliest date, the advantages are to be gained are perfectly enormous. Now, that's a dramatic statement from the man who founded Northrop Grumman and who had been, whose own X research had been shunted down by the Air Force Secretary, who eventually became the CEO of Converse. So, Convair, yes. Now, it's very interesting because when you look at this guy's life and the arc of his life, one of the weird people that he opens the door to back there in time and history is Jack Parsons through the figure of Frank Molina. So it's very interesting to note that in the history, the kind of occult antics of Parsons, that one of the people that he gets involved with there is L. Ron Hubbard. And then they have this battle over a woman. And then he's married to this woman, and then her younger sister becomes his paramour. And that woman, her name is Northrop. It is very interesting. And she is there in California. Her family's in California, just like Jack Northrop. So that struck me as very interesting. I was not able to track it back, but what I found were a number of other researchers who picked up on that and had tried to figure out what the combinations were there. And I'll read you a little bit about that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep tonight in episode 206, NASA's Secret Intelligence UFO File. And we are going to take your questions here momentarily. Before we go any further, what do you got over there?
David Tormina said, DJ, wasn't it Convair who later joined with General Dynamics?
Yes, and it's interesting because I was looking at who had merged into Northrop Grumman as well, and basically, Link Temco Vout, they were absorbed into our friends at Northrop, and then General Dynamics themselves became enmeshed with. Actually, it was the Hughes organization. I'll have to double check on whether Northrop was merged in with General Dynamics. But what is interesting is that the entire Hughes aerospace piece, which was a gigantic motivator for the political situation from the 1940s through the 1970s, and really achieved incredible things because Nixon had given his old pal Howard Hughes the ability to write off all of his spacefaring activity as a medical charity. And by the way, that's one of the things that Bobby Kennedy was going to expose in the 1968 election. You don't hear that too much, but we've covered it. So yeah, there's a lot of moves there.
Wow, I forgot all about that.
Yes. It is. It's very disturbing. And I was able to get some commentary from the man who worked in Howard Hughes' organization, was very close to him. And I put it in the X-Protect documentary. Okay, a couple of quick quotes, and then we're off to your questions. We're off to the races. All right.
You have so much to get through tonight.
All right. Let's see here. Well, this is just too juicy about Hubbard and Crowley. And it comes from our friend Nick Redfern. By the way, I don't believe that the Collins elite are real. I think that this was disinformation that was fed to a journalist. And so I want to preface that because they try to soak this around this whole Collins elite thing. But I take that as something that was literally made up out of whole cloth by an intel agency. Okay. But this is very interesting. The investigations of Jack Parsons involving the FBI Hughes aircraft, that's who Parsons was working for when he died, by the way. Strange explosion. Sad that. Exposed many of those on the projects to his other world, namely the one that revolved around Aleister Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard. Some of the people, those names, the military names you'll see in the Freedom of Information files on Parsons, were people I got to know. Duke told me. Duke is his source. There were a secret envy around Parsons with his dames, as we called them, and Thelema. It was risque and something of a lure. But there was a thing that connected everyone where we were all on the investigation of Parsons, taking the papers from Hughes, but for all his writings, he was a fascinating man, but very troubled. When the currently available FBI, Air Force, and Army files on Parsons specifically do not tell us are two things. First was what the Air Material Command got involved with, the Israeli connections to Parsons' world. We learned this wasn't the first time they'd been speaking with Parsons. And this goes on into a very interesting intrigue where they were trying to say that Parsons may have been working to spy on Hughes' organization for the Israelis at that period of time. But here's the part that grabbed me, and see if it grabs you too. Also, that Major Sam Bruno himself told us they had a meeting, both Parsons and Kenneth Arnold, and there were tales of Parsons being linked with Kenneth Arnold. Now, Kenneth Arnold, very famously, fantastic, excellent expert pilot who observed over Mount Rainier these flying saucers, 9 of them, doing this incredible pattern, traveling at amazing speeds. He gets down off that flight and he says to his other pilot friends, "My God, this is what I witnessed." Then they get some microphones in front of him and the whole flying saucer thing takes off. That's June of 1947. Okay, trek with me just a little bit here. When I asked for clarification on this particular point, Duke said that someone had undertaken some special digging and found out that Parsons and Arnold had a limited degree of personal contact as a result of their having a mutual acquaintance. According to Duke, it went as follows. Parsons was friends with L. Ron Hubbard, of course, famously. And I always like to point out that it was Aleister Crowley who said, I know a few things about L. Ron Hubbard, and I think you should stay away from him because he doesn't seem like a very moral guy. And if you get Aleister Crowley questioning your morals, you get deep problems there, L. Ron. But Hubbard wrote science fiction stories, and he was certainly, his most celebrated story, Fear, was published as a novel in the July 1940 issue of Unknown Fantasy Fiction, which was edited by John Campbell and was the editor also of Astounding Science Fiction. Hubbard's 1980 novel, Battlefield Earth, was made into a megabucks movie starring actor and Scientologist John Travolta in 2000. Hubbard was well known to Raymond Palmer, the editor of the wildly popular science fiction magazine Amazing Stories, and Palmer was friends with Arnold and helped write and even publish Arnold's book, The Coming of the Saucers, which is an amazing book full of dramatic revelations, the first Men in Black cases, the intense surveillance, the assassination of 2 pilots, bringing UFO wreckage to Washington. I mean, incredible. Hardly just a book about sightings. The sabotage of Arnold's own plane is involved there as well because they didn't want him around talking about those. We all knew something happened. The second thing, well, I guess I can summarize this from here. Basically, what he's getting there and what unfurls from that is that Parsons becomes obsessed with this thing about Arnold having this sighting, and he gets to meet Arnold and all the rest of it through his friend Ray Palmer, and Palmer is hiring Arnold out to investigate the Maury Island case for him, which is the first UFO crash before Roswell. And all kinds of unique things happen there, including the fact that people who later show up around the Kennedy assassination are involved in that case. And we've covered that extensively. But here's the kind of key point in all of this. What happens is Parsons takes from the sighting of Arnold that the UFOs are going to unleash a new Crowleyanism on the world, and that Thelema will be known as the religion. throughout the world. That's his take on UFOs coming to the fore, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. And very interestingly, of course, he won't live to see it because in 2 years he will die in a very curious explosion, and as part of the Hughes laboratory. And this guy dealt with explosives his whole life. It wasn't very likely for something like that to happen. That certainly was an X-Protect activity, but who were they protecting? You see how this goes. But before I go any further with any of it, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it all over to you and your questions.
I'm getting a really good question here. Hold on
Excellent.
a second. This is from David Donaway.
This is what we call good timing.
All right. So let me just put it together. Okay. So this is a bundle. So Jack Parsons consulted for Israel's rocket program after he was accused of espionage and had his U.S. security clearances revoked, forcing him out of the American space program.
Yes.
Was Jack Parsons planning to defect to Israel before he got blown up? In 1950, Herbert T. Rosenfeld, president of the Southern Californian chapter of the American Technion Society, a Zionist group supporting Israel, offered Parsons a position with the Israeli rockets program, I think is what he's saying.
Yeah, the thing is, Israel was under, the United States was such a power player. It's not like he could defect to Israel and be protected because, we're so close in that period with Israel and Israel's defense and everything else that I don't think that he was going to defect. But there's something odd about the FBI looking into him and really thinking, oh, he's up to espionage, he's up to occult stuff, he's up to maybe releasing things around the X piece. I think we could also look at X-Protect as seeing him meeting with Arnold and all the rest of it as, this guy is going to be able to be part of team around this. Was he working on rocket technology, or was he working on UFO redevelopment technology for another country? That's the kind of thing where I think you'd get bumped off. I mentioned Quetzalcoatl and forgot to give the payoff. Here's the payoff. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, I showed you our friend's flying wing, Jack Northrop of Northrop Grumman. I showed you his deep, deep belief in the UFO file and his account of his top engineers saying it was real and all the rest of it. That's what's on the record. You can only imagine what's off the record with somebody like Northrop who ran that organization. But around 1971, an unusual thing happens, and this is going to be a prelude into an episode I'm going to do about dinosaurs. And you might think, dinosaurs are an interesting topic. Well, it even goes a lot deeper than that. There's something very, very strange about the presence of Andrew Carnegie, who would mobilize a team anytime dinosaur bones and ruins were found anywhere in the world. He would send a team to be there first, and he set up this gigantic museum of dinosaur remains in Pittsburgh. There's something very, very interesting about that, but I have a feeling there's steganography in it, and there's something in relation to what I'm going to tell you next about how the mystery schools had information and that how they got it out through something like a museum showing. Okay. Quetzalcoatl, he is a kind of Mayan savior figure. He's associated with Venus. Whenever they had these festivals about Quetzalcoatl, they would, if they would do any kind of sacrifice activity, they would never do human sacrifice. One of the unusual things about this figure is supposedly the mythology was so deeply ingrained in the Aztecs, post-Mayan era, that when our friend Cortez shows up in 1519 on the shores of Mexico, it's very, very unusual because they think this is Quetzalcoatl coming back, and that Montezuma is supposedly fooled by this, and that's why his guard is down, and why 50 guys can overwhelm the Aztecs. Now, what I want to show you is an image of the Quetzalcoatl priest conjuring Quetzalcoatl, and sometimes the pronunciation goes Coatl and all the rest. So, but I'm just going to say Coatl. um, and what goes on here is quite interesting because the priest is wearing sets of X-steganography. And if you go into some of the comments that the Austrian mystic and genius Rudolf Steiner put forward about the etheric being of Quetzalcoatl meeting and being conjured with the priest and being not quite human, but etheric human. So he is portrayed in ceremony and everything else as a winged serpent. Actually, the name itself means that. And what they will do, some of those pyramids, is they'll have his winged serpent body, and the sun will come down and hit each point of it, and that's the whole calendar. So it really, it's a very integrated culture with the figure itself. This is the image, and what we see is, the priest in his waistband there is demonstrating the X-steganography, and he is standing and conjures up Coatl through this ceremony. And what the steganography.
I'm also impressed by all the blue.
Yeah, isn't that? I know.
It's pretty stunning.
It is, and I think that's red ochre too, which you see throughout the Mayans' artwork. Now, here's what's interesting. When you get around this figure, a few things are very obvious, but what's happening with the X-steganography there is, remember, the Atlanteans had advanced technology and almost destroyed the entire planet with it. And there's a whole apotheum overlay from that period, and that's where the X-steganography came out of. These are the things that we've put forward in a variety of episodes. So that X-steganography represents advanced knowledge of humanity and then how they used it against themselves, and how the X-steganography is like the higher hidden aspect of this, and how they are sort of pledging to that secrecy, that if you present us with these secrets, we won't abuse them. That's what the X-steganography is saying here, and also that we will maintain the tradition of the advances from Atlantis. Now, oddly enough, in 1971, this archaeologist finds the remains of an unusual dinosaur bird that no one had ever heard of. And they did some reenactments of what this bird may have looked like. They even did it in a London fair. You can see these beings just hovering over. And
wow. Well, sculpturally, they're pretty stunning.
Yes, they are indeed. This is also interesting, just as an aside, but in the Quetzalcoatl, in his very unusual ceremonies that they would do, if you look at those Mayan remains of the ceremonies themselves, here's something interesting that you're going to see. You're going to see that when they are doing the ceremony, basically to conjure him, that everything starts levitating. And they're trying to give the impression that things are being levitated by the fact that they're using their voice. And so there's the priest.
Like in the Bible.
Yeah. And there's a priest in the middle, and then there are these figures, and then they're doing the voice things, and things start lifting. Just to give you a quick idea that he's associated with the kind of magic, going on here, power over the elements and everything else. So what happens very strangely, and I have another picture of this bird I want to show you. He ends up calling the bird Quetzalcoatlus. And then the other part of the name, he says Northrop. And he gets in touch with Northrop, and he says, the figure that I found is exactly like your wingless craft. And he finds out that Northrop was very interested in Mayan mythology. Now, it's been my belief that there's been a secret group that operates around aeronautics from an early period, just like some of the early airship stuff. And that, Lindbergh, one of the things that he did in between his great cross-Atlantic travel in the spirit of St. Louis and everything else, was search for ruins over that Yucatan jungle. And I think that this group was aware of the fact that knowledge like this was going to come about. That's another shot of a reconstruction of the bones of this bird. And so he goes ahead and he names the bird, finding Quetzalcoatlus, Northrop, and then Northrop I. So this kind of strange connection of Northrop and his wingless, his flying wing piece with these strange bird dinosaur ruins, and then the names being aligned, Quetzalcoatl and Northrop, is very, very unusual in my opinion. And here's just a quick take on this. One important body of myths describes Quetzalcoatl as the priest king of Tula, the capital of the Toltecs. He never offered human victims, only snakes, birds, butterflies, but the god of the night sky, Tezcatlipoca, expelled him from Tula by performing dramatic feats of black magic. Quetzalcoatl wandered down the coast of the divine water of the Atlantic Ocean, immolated himself on a pyre, emerging as the planet Venus. So there's a lot there in that retelling of that myth. It's got a lot of Egyptian overtures. It's got Osiris in it, and it has that black magic piece. So I wanted to make sure we included that when we were talking about Northrop, because it was just such a strange interface in between the two. So back to your question.
I would love to have Gigi
Yes.
analyze that, just
Yes.
see into that. There's something.
Oh,
I don't know
yeah,
if she's
yeah.
ever really done much about like the Mayans or the Aztecs, but that would be incredible.
I thought almost exact same
Mhm.
thought. Yes.
Okay, Blazing River says it would seem Parsons would have been one of the first to see the Roswell crash since he was the guy for propulsion. Was Parsons working on something in his lab from the Roswell crash? Could that have been what blew him up?
That's a real good point. Look, the fact that he became obsessed with the idea that the UFO file was going to spread Crowleyanism is interesting in itself. What's fascinating too is that Crowley, with the whole Babylon working and all these things, he was not behind the idea of Parsons doing that with Hubbard. He thought it was the combination of the two were disastrous. And he thought the woman, Northrop, that Parsons had gotten himself involved with and, Hubbard had stolen away and all the rest, was a vampire. This is how this is how Crowley saw the whole setup. So we have to kind of, it's interesting because a lot of people say, yeah, Crowley did the Babylon Rising, and then we got the UFO thing. Well, actually, his chief OTO man over here, Parsons, put together the Babylon Rising ritual based on the Moonchild book. Now, the book's from 1917, and Crowley put together this whole ritual. And it's quite fascinating, but he's really, really not into the idea of Hubbard doing that with Northrop and Parsons. So, that's very telling, and it's not often brought up. Often we just hear the payoff, which is Crowley was doing these rituals and the UFOs showed up. Well, actually, someone was doing the Crowley rituals maybe without the safeguards, and that's how you get it. But then immediately Parsons rushes to this idea and meets with Arnold. Now, that's also something that you don't hear too much about, and I know a great deal about Arnold's history. It makes sense to me that Parsons would be right onto this. And then, of course, he dies 2 years later. Yes.
It would be incredible. And I mean, it's too bad we don't have somebody like a Mae Brussel around. You need someone who just has that kind of mind. We need a timeline for UFOs. You know what I mean? For everything. Maybe AI can do this eventually, but I want to see it laid out like on a long sheet of paper, right? All these, the interconnected webs.
Oh, there's no question.
Relationships.
There's no question. Yeah. And But remember, you can get really superficial versions of that too. So you have to, what you're looking for actually is the real potent timeline.
I want all of your information to be
Yes.
mapped out visually so I can see it.
Well, that's what we're trying to do with the docuseries, and that's why, you know, the more that we do those, the more we can kind of bring forward this information. I want to read the Werner von Braun Elon quote, something I put in the Pyramid X documentary. And this comes directly from his book, Project Mars, A Technical Tale, Dr. von Braun. And it's 1950, all right? So, you know, keep that in mind. Long before our friend Elon was even born. I think he's born in the 70s sometime. So he's 55, somewhere around there. Okay. And now that he's taking Ozempic, maybe he won't last that much longer, too. All right. Here we go. The efforts of Earthlings to subjugate nature on their richly endowed planet seemed to the Martians technically extremely primitive, but again, they drew the conclusion that these pitiful efforts were but an additional proof that God had inspired the doers, that this inspiration was inseparably linked to the inner urge of action, which had been a driving power of Martian civilization. The Martian government was directed by 10 men, the leader of whom was elected by universal suffrage for 5 years and entitled, quote, Elon, E-L-O-N, unmistakable. 2 houses of parliament enacted the laws to be administered by the Elon and his cabinet. And here we have, of course, Elon Musk obsessed with going to Mars because we must preserve the light of consciousness. Well, look, Elon, the light of consciousness goes far beyond going to Mars and has nothing to do with it. So don't let that be the reason. That's absurd. But it is very interesting that that's the tell in the middle of all this, which is that's been predicted. I pointed out that, you know, with the whole Delshau work, that this has been a prediction as well about Trump in 45. And they've embedded it in the airship artistry of the period. And those airship pictures were based on the group that was operating in the 1850s. So how far are they seeing into the future? And here we have von Braun doing the same thing. When you get around aerospace, you're getting around a predictive function. And the predictive function is operating in order to send messages out there. And this is part of the mystery school work, which has to be integrated on the aerospace side if we're to understand the nature of the type of thing that we're looking at. How do you get a scientific, technical tale predicting and giving you the name of the man who'll be leading the largest space defense contractor on a mission to Mars? That's rich. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Scarlet Fire says NASA's annual budget is set through a complex process involving the White House and Congress, and the fiscal year 2024 budget was $24.9 billion. If the NASA budget is $25 billion, dividing it by 52, the number of weeks in a year, results in approximately $480.77 million per week. Just for perspective.
Well, I'll tell you something. Something is, look, they've cut back the budget of NASA to almost nothing. So I don't know. There's something not quite right in those numbers. So you get a very, very slimmed down version of budget. They've continued to have cutbacks in the NASA budget. This is part of the problem because they pump up this privatization of space and they minimize the public government program for space and have kept it on a back burner. So it gets tricky, and they do, you know, on the black budget side, they flash the money around quick. And it's interesting you mentioned this because NASA is one of the, along with HUD, are known as the black budget slush funds. That's where the whole missing money thing, that's where from these two organizations, a great deal of it goes missing. And of course, the DOD itself, let's not forget. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Actually, I want to switch to COG for a second. Blazing River says, off topic, sorry, but isn't the shutdown real close to COG being put in place? Could we address that?
Well, look, the shutdowns are always threatened every year, and it's a way of brinkmanship. It's kind of like when North Korea threatens, I'm going to send a missile into the Sea of Japan, and then they get rewarded with a bunch of money and go away for a few years, and then they get more money when they come back. And we get this idea of the North Korean leader as this madman or whatever, when he was kind of raised in colleges in Europe and country clubs. I mean, he's hardly like a North Korean peasant. Um, but what I'll say is that the shutdowns definitely represent a breach in the government. And I think that the Trump administration is correct that they shouldn't have to attach all of these different things that the Democrats are trying to ram through, especially since they have the presidency in both houses. So, the flash of power that the Democrats are trying to do are saying you need 60 votes in order to bypass us, and you don't have them. But they do have some people breaking off on the Democrat side to do this. So this is the brinkmanship that each side plays for money. And the thing is, the Trump administration is in a very good position to say, you guys are the ones who have to cave on this, because I don't want, money going for illegal aliens and things of this nature. But I will say you have to be careful with that too, because if if it ends up looking like you're a megalomaniac who's trying to control things, the thing to do is let them sort of, if your opponent is doing that badly, let them show to the public how bad their leadership is. And I'll tell you, the Democrat leadership is in the absolute tank right now. I think the problem, this is my free advice for the Trump administration, which I love to give in every show, but statecraft, crafting the message, and, if you're going to be your normal personality there as President Trump, that's fine. People have got to know you that way. But you can't have a bunch of mini-me's, It can't be like J.D. Vance and people like that acting, tough and all that. It's not who they are, and it's very transparent. As a matter of fact, when you look at J.D. Vance doing that, it makes you start to wonder and say, I wonder if DeSantis wouldn't be a better replacement for Trump come 2028 than Vance, because Vance is not, he's got all the smarts and everything else, but he's not playing to that. He's playing to the crowd idea of what a tough guy is. And I did get this as well. And remember, I like so many of the appointees in the Trump administration, and they are so much better than the Democrats, who were hiring freaks to run things like nuclear agencies and health and human services. I mean, in this administration, you get RFK Jr., fantastic as HHS. You've got Tulsi Gabbard as DNI. I mean, these are really good choices. I'm having a problem with Patel because I felt that for a few reasons, there's a lot of self-promotion. And when he comes out, he's always talking about how great he's doing and how he did it faster than other people, getting Tyler Robinson and stuff. But I think that they have not done a good job on that case. And I don't think they've brought enough forward to the public. And there's a kind of a weird, jokey thing going on with these figures that doesn't hold to the level of who they should be. So here we have the FBI director wearing these American flag socks. Look, I love the American flag, but I don't think that the FBI director should be wearing American flag socks like that. I think it's goofy, and I think it betrays the image of the office. And I've been seeing a lot of that. I saw it with the VP during the, talking to the press, and he got off talking about sombreros and all. Come on. This is a very serious situation. People's jobs are on the line. Stay serious, be serious. And you've got the biggest job in the world, working for the president. So, my vibe on that was that they could do a lot better. Not to be mistaken for the fact that the Democrats were an absolute train wreck. And they were, the people that they had, like Kamala and all the rest, were, heading America for oblivion with insanity. But I do want to say that the people in the Trump administration should come off with more statecraft and be more serious about what they're doing in terms of their public persona. So that's my 2 cents and free advice. Yes, Miss
Tina
Olivia.
Borch says J. Edgar Hoover wore fishnet pantyhose.
Oh yeah,
Touche.
yeah. J. Edgar, what do you got?
Okay, so again with COG and whatnot, Channeling the Heart Barbara Joyce says there's a piece on YouTube saying NASA shut down as 3I Atlas gets the closest to Mars. And Deborah McAdoo says NASA is not sharing data right now about 3I Atlas because of the government shutdown.
Oh yeah. See, there's a few things here, and I should say this: when the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth brought in all of these people, and they were all the leaders from all our various commands and all the rest of it. That's an unusual move. So they had to be consulting about something that would affect every aspect of the bases that America has around the world. Now, they could have been responding to some of the tough talk that they were getting from the Russians. And, again, with the Russians, Putin came out and he was talking, and he made some comments that sounded sort of presidential on his side and all the rest of it. And then he starts talking about how Germany is rearming, and then he goes into a little routine. And I'm like, are these people all being reduced to infants or whatever? And he starts to say, oh yeah, Germany, you think you can do that? You think you can rival us? Haha, let's see if you can try. I mean, so everyone becomes a Bond villain all of a sudden. I think this is a very strange period in history where you're like, can somebody please take the mantle of statesman in these situations? But yes, it's an excellent point, and I think that it's possible that Hegseth called in all of these military leaders because they were dealing with the idea that somebody is trying to portray a UFO threat. One of the things I didn't get into tonight were all the drone incursions. I've been watching them closely. I've been putting some posts up on Twitter about it. And I've got some news headlines about it here. I thought this one was particularly interesting. It said Denmark, and of course, the president of Denmark came out and talked about this extensively, and also talked about the idea that, we don't know. We think something else is going on here. This isn't normal. And Russia themselves said, well, it isn't us. This sounds very much like what was going on in New Jersey here earlier this year. Denmark says professional actor behind drone incursions over its airports. Just before we went live tonight, there were drone incursions over France that were unidentified, over Germany that were unidentified. This is going on en masse over Europe, just like it was going on here, to the point where they were flying them over Bedminster, which was Trump's, New Jersey Mar-a-Lago. And look, he wouldn't go there when they were happening. Obviously, it was a very serious issue. He was president-elect at the time. There's some entity involved with these drones. The drones are not UFOs because we can see that they are drones. We know what drones are. Now, I said the big stress test for the independent media, they failed. It was December 2024 when all the drone things hit, and they try to blow them off because the independent media doesn't know a great deal about the UFO file, unfortunately. I'd be happy to teach them some. But they have big problems there because since they don't know how to deal with it, they're like, oh, people are mistaking the planes for drones. And no, people know what a plane looks like. This was a surge. This was a massive surge. And then if you look back over that history, military bases were being surged. If you go even further back, the Northcom commander himself was leading a operation called Homeland Synchronization. And that was in the same period, and he was doing it. And the theme of the exercise was UAPs versus UAVs, okay? Unmanned aerial vehicles versus UAPs, which are, the new stupid name for UFOs. So that's what was going on there. And they got a great deal of data mining for how people dealt with this anomalous threat. But look, there were witnesses who were like, basically, my house lit up. It sounded like there was somebody riding a motorcycle on my roof, Judge Napolitano, who lives in New Jersey, and he's a very well-known figure, he said there were drones sitting over his house. So no, there was a massive drone activity. As a matter of fact, very recently with this drone incursion, and I showed this to Miss Olivia. I took pictures of drones over Harvard,
Mhm.
uh, and that just happened. So something is very unusual was taking place. I don't know who was running those drones. They were weird looking though, and you don't see them just hovering around here. So I think that there's a great deal to be learned from these incursions. How can they obviously know who they are. They must know who they are. Now, when the question came out, Trump said, "Oh, as soon as I get into office, I'm going to announce who it was." Instead, when he got into office, he said, "Don't worry about it. I can't talk about it, but don't. It's not a problem." That's not good enough, you know. So we're not getting it from our leaders. Somewhere there's an answer for this. The raids over Denmark with these drones are swarms. So it's meant to provoke a reaction. And I think the comments of the Denmark president, including the fact of saying, these are we don't know what they are. They're UFOs. And here was finally I wanted to mention, since I mentioned Paul Hellyer, the defense minister of Canada, who we talked to, had such great conversations with, the late Paul Hellyer. Here was his headline. It said, "Cabal keeping UFO secrets is to blame for the world's woes," says former cabinet minister Paul Hellyer. And he said the challenges that could be faced with extraterrestrial technology. Former Liberal defense minister tells Toronto crowd on Saturday. And he said, if we had that advanced technology, you wouldn't have global warming, any of those things. You wouldn't even have to worry about it. That was very interesting that we had people on that level of the government who were trying to tell us something was going on in the background there. I got the message, and it's been watered down dramatically through the podcast Pop Click Worlds, as I've described it, and it's been watered down by the UFO celebrity side of it. But at the core, we need to take the whole thing seriously and find out what the nature of the people who hold the secrecy is all about, and what that secrecy is doing to the larger scientific, financial, political aspirations of the country and around the world. And with the drone technology being used to provoke and, I don't know, spook these other countries, I think a new way of getting to the truth about these things that doesn't involve the sensationalism is called for. And, I was lucky enough to talk to people like Hellyer, who were very serious about it and knew from being a defense minister what was at stake. So it's important, I think, for all of us to take the right approach on this and to not fall for the kind of sensationalist part. Okay, Miss Olivia, 2 more questions.
Well, Dan Page says, who were the first individuals in government who first became aware of the UFO/alien presence and decided to keep it secret?
Oh, I think that's been going on for a long, long, long time now. It's funny you said that. Now, in the era where John Worrell Keeley had developed these incredible motors and things, I got one of the headlines from the era about what people were seeing with his stuff. And he's an incredible story there, of course, the etheric energy that he was using, the fact that he could get things to fly and levitate, and in some cases maybe fly as much as clocked by the U.S. Army 500 miles per hour. That's some of the stories. And the fact that the mystery schools like anthroposophy and theosophy made huge proclamations about Keeley and how important his work was there in Philadelphia in the 1880s tells us a great deal. But that's one of the original headlines: mystery motor run without gas. This is the nature of the things. These things have been around. When we get around it, they get shut down in some variety. Remember, there were so many people around the free energy movements who came up with different type of motors, different type of approaches, and their work was shut down. They were stonewalled at the patent offices. There's still a great, huge movement around this worldwide. So, when you mention alternative energy and things of this nature, it has to be a major part of the whole equation. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so everybody was asking this earlier. Esoteric 369. DJ, did Jimmy Carter talk about the type of alien beings that abducted him? And Karen Carpenter says, do you think the aliens Carter dealt with were the same sort that Eisenhower is said to have met with?
Yes. Excellent question. Look, Stanton Friedman was a nuclear physicist and had worked on a lot of black projects. I had a number of conversations with Stanton when he was living up in Canada. And I got to meet him a couple of times. And his work was very rigorous. And even with situations like the Bob Lazar story and stuff, he was not having it because he knew that Lazar had lied about his educational background at MIT and didn't trust him with the rest of the story, which is a good position to hold, even if you think that Lazar was telling something of value. So this is a tough guy, is my point. And he had researched down the possibility for this story, which is in UFO lore about President Eisenhower getting contacted by an off-world group and meeting them at Edwards Air Force Base. And his excuse at the time was, I'm going to California for dental work. And there were witnesses to him at Edwards Air Force Base, and there were witnesses to this craft and all the rest of it. And after going through all the detailed study of this, Stanton Friedman, hard-nosed researcher, said, he said it to me a couple of times and in our interviews, so it's on the record. He said, I'm convinced that the trail is there, that Eisenhower did in fact meet with this group. Now, the word is that they said to him, we have this advanced technology and everything else, but we want to share a message with you. It's kind of like philosophical message, not to destroy each other. There's a long road for your technological advancement. Now, that might sound kind of corny or science fiction-y, and yet supposedly Eisenhower asked him, if we had the ability militarily with your technology to do this, that might unify the world. And they said, no, you'd be tempted to use the technology in adverse ways. Now, this group is what we refer to in general lore around UFOs as the Pleiadians, so this kind of Nordic variety. And it's very interesting because in what we started with the Granada story, that was all about a Nordic type as well. So supposedly there's that group, and then there are these other groups like the Greys who are willing to trade certain types of technology for advantages of being able to do things on Earth, like abduction. So it's funny when you mention Carter. All Carter could remember was seeing the big craft in the sky that looked like the moon. He said, but we knew it wasn't the moon, and it was hovering. And there were like half a dozen people there. Now, what I got from my sessions with this mystical channel in Canada, the late Rick Thurston, who was very much like Edgar Casey. I mean, you could feel the change in him when he was in Trans Channel. But when I asked him about President Carter and this whole piece, he said, but it's very interesting. Carter, he had the interest in it. He understood it from the sighting, but he didn't remember being abducted. And that the group that had abducted him were these Pleiadians, just like the group that had met with Eisenhower. So that's the story in the lore. You can accept it or reject it. But I think it's interesting. Carter was very interested in the UFO file, demonstrated with him firing George H.W. Bush, and whatever else you can think about Carter, love him or hate him as a president. I think he's a better person than president. But he fired Bush. That's pretty good. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's X Series 206, NASA Secret Intelligence UFO File. I have enough material here for another episode.
2 more shows.
Yeah, so there's going to be more. I have to really expand our kind of dossier on the public reporting about NASA based on what's going on here with this move. I think it represents a huge, and I mean gigantic shift in how things are going to be done around space. And I think with what's happening in relation to space, like the Artemis thing and all the rest of it, they're going to face the same problem, which is why the space program went black in the first place, which is on Mars, on the moon, there are ruins, there are indications that something else is going on. So, um, you know, and there's a great possibility for the misuse of those types of discoveries as well. Don't forget. So keep that in mind. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Hunter Jones, does this tie into NIMSA?
Sure. Yeah, there's no question about it. See, the NIMSA research is so important because if we understand there was a group already operating in the 19th century with that advanced airship technology and was far beyond the Wright brothers, and so the arc of what they were doing was advanced. I also think there are indications earlier with some of the prototypes that Leonardo da Vinci did of flying machines that there were, obviously the mystical groups understood and had flight. There's no question in my mind about that. And I'll tell you something strange as well, which is apparently there's an assistant of Da Vinci who worked on these things much deeper, and that his work became adopted as Da Vinci's, but it was actually his work. And I'll bring out more about that. I have a whole special coming up about it. So there's something very strange about that. But NIMSA represents a break in the research because Delchau is in that period through the 1850s. He's sent over here basically to spy on the Sonora Aero Club, who are a group of flight enthusiasts and scientists of that period. And what he witnesses with his abilities as an artist, he draws. And then we're just lucky that somehow these drawings come back into the public, through an antique store or different versions of this. They were in an attic and all the rest. Some people say they were preserved this way and rediscovered this way, and it's all a story, so it's very interesting. Of course, we've had people on the program come on and talk about it, like Walter Bosley. And I think it's such an artistic rendering of that history and that arc that you're seeing some piece of the flight reflection aspect. The UFO file brings things into a huge overdrive in the 20th century, and it's a rediscovery of that kind of Atlantean apotheum piece. And from all my research, what I deduced was that what was going on in the minds of the leadership and the people who were really keeping the secrecy heavy on this, I mean, beyond military secrecy. Remember, Robert Sarbarker said, no, it's a higher level than the atomic bomb. So how high is that? I mean, so nuclear secrecy, and then up here you get UFO secrecy. So if it's up there, it means there's some effect involved. And what I did is I went through years of studying different types of effects of the UFO craft when they showed up, and through having met people like John Mack and stuff when I was 18, 19, I had some indications from their research about the weird things that were going on. Like people, when they would get abducted, their cars would float up into craft. They would go through walls. Time would stop. And it's very interesting because the time stopping thing is the big tell, I think, in all of that. That a different type of physics gets introduced by the presence of whatever this is. And the X technology works like that too. So the X technology resides then in the UFO file. So the Tesla, Keeley type stuff, that's in there. So, but whatever that effect is, when UFOs show up, they have the same impact. And there are also weird things there, like when they land, nothing will grow there again, things like that. And that animals don't seem to like them. So there's something kind of anti nature about these craft. John Keel used to talk about how massive lightning storms would precede them very often. So there's something weird about that. Anyway, I deduced that it was the apotheum effect, a kind of reality distortion that takes place when these things show up. Entire cities are blacked out. As a matter of fact, the big blackout in history from the 1965 period, that gigantic blackout of New York City was directly related to these major craft sightings all around. And so you get this, cars shut off, regular technology doesn't work, things of this nature. That's the apotheum effect. And if these things are showing up like that, then if you're keeping the secrecy and you're studying it, you realize, it opens up dimensions. In some cases, the people who are working on it see relatives who have passed on, things like that. I mean, these are effects, you're operating without physical universal law. So when you introduce that type of physics, then you're in a totally different realm in terms of how you protect that
I'm going to
information.
challenge this a little.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, if you were talking about spiritual beings, higher dimensional beings that are beneficial to humanity, that are benevolent, right? These are beings that have supernatural abilities to, like Jesus, like, make things grow. They have regenerative capabilities.
Oh, yeah.
It would not, so whatever technology, this actually makes a case as you're speaking this, and I'm thinking, for this sort of regressive aliens, that's coming from a darker order, a more
Yeah.
destructive order, you know?
Obviously, it's strange, isn't it? Because there's the whole abduction aspect itself, which suggests it's just another group with no more scruples than humanity going around doing scientific studies and using us as lab rats, right? That's not very good. So no, I don't think that the idea of advanced technology means advanced spirituality at all. So you're right. I mean, it represents a darker aspect. There's no question about it. We don't know, uh, but part of those answers have been deduced by the research that they've been able to do on secret levels, and they're addicted to maintaining that secrecy at the cost of everything else, even civilization itself, as long as they're at the top of that pyramid with the deep information that they've gleaned from this, kind of mystical knowledge, physics knowledge, political control. And this is an era where, a lot of that has been challenged on some level. And I think they're generally at the top, they are determining that this is a period of time to consolidate things into what they call brighter, tighter hands. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 206, NASA's secret intelligence UFO file. Yeah, the UFO aspect, deep. The history of it, deep. Mystical aspects around it, unquestionable. Technology, um, you know, losing memory, losing time. I mean, obviously, there's a great deal involved here. We'll take a couple more questions from you, from Miss Olivia, and then we'll wrap up our show. What do you got?
Esoteric 369. Speaking of high strangeness, do you think we are living in a simulation being watched over by some sinister beings?
I think that the Ahriman concept and the Steiner work opens up a great deal of that vista for me. So that there's a battle, and every religion has this, every spiritual tradition, every mythology. There's a battle between good and evil going on in the background, and it's played out in archetypes and symbolism. I mean, even the UFO thing is an archetype, right? It's an archetype of another. And how many times have advanced beings shown up on the shores of a different land and caused problems, or advancements too? I mean, certainly a trade with all that. But in Steiner's work, it's so advanced. And I have to say, we have a very special Steiner episode coming up Steiner's work is reaching out and showing us into the 21st century. Back when he's writing in 1919, 1920, and he's saying, basically, I can look at his life and say he spent about 4 decades trying to warn the world of this harmonic force, the dark astral force that was going to come in and through technology cut off humanity's connection to its own spiritual realization, to its own spiritual awareness. And that basically cuts off who you are and makes you easier to manipulate. And I think that there are forces on that level that will do this. So when you're talking about is this assimilation and all that, the idea of just some like advanced culture somewhere running us as a simulation, I don't get into that, but I see it as a huge, um, you know, play in the spiritual sense. It's a huge battle for humanity's soul, as it were, in the grand scheme of things. And it's played out through symbols and archetypes. And so in that sense, I think that there's a battle that takes place there. And I don't think we know the outcome of the battle, but I think that people like Steiner, Casey, and others were giving us that hint that, you're at the kind of apex point and you're at this kind of crossroads with all of this. And that it's a huge step to be able to acknowledge your ancient past in Atlantis and the whole curve and arc of humanity since then, and the power and the possibility for destruction or great creation. They're both there, and that's what I think is in the heart of it all.
It's very simple, and we want to understand so much, but if we just understand ourselves, it's kind of enough, because that's really all we can do, right? You can't understand something that is of another order. You know, even a slightly different, it's hard enough if you're not a narcissist or if you're not a psychopath to try to understand them. You can get the gist, but you really can't empathize.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I object. The only thing I object to when it gets around UFOs is when people are just, oh, they're demons or something like that. You can't look at it like that. Look, let's take Gordon Cooper, for example. He went over to train in Germany how to fly, and he would fly in formation with other pilots. Then these craft would show up and they would start imitating the movements and doing them better and ultimately shooting right by them. So that is a technical demonstration, right? That isn't a devil, it's you're flying out there, you're demonstrating your technology on Earth. And here's this other thing that's coming in and saying, we have better technology, and you're not aware of what it is. So it doesn't make it demonic to not understand what it is. So, positive, negative. If it's some advanced scientific group that's visiting here and they see you as a lab rat, I mean, that's not a good scenario, is it? Like I said, but I don't buy in immediately into this kind of thing. It's one of the reasons I didn't like the Collins Elite thing, because I thought it was playing into that. I think it's important to see it for what it is. If you listen to the pilots from World War II talk about Foo Fighters, they would say, these green balls of light would follow them, do all these maneuvers, sometimes hover in front of their plane and seem to come in. So we don't know, you don't know what they are.
Well,
but
because they know maneuvers.
Yes.
They know conscious pilots.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And this is the wonderful thing about Cooper as well. And I go back to Cooper a lot because I think he was an honest person with a great deal of knowledge. But he was trained, as a pilot, as an astronaut, and other things. So when he sees UFOs doing this stuff, he's kind of like, when they ask him, do you think it was intelligently controlled? He's like, what do you think? If it's following my maneuvers and then outdoing me and then taking off? Yeah, obviously somebody is controlling it. The beings that are inside of it are controlling the craft, or somebody is remote controlling it, but it's intelligent like we are. So that part should be pretty obvious. And I think that
Mm.
the interface of some groups with our own military industrial complex is where some of these other questionable pieces come in. That's where I think maybe the abduction experience that are negative plays in, because I think it might be some combination of what, the whole grays idea, whether you consider them off-world or terrestrial or whatever, they do seem regressive. Yes, Miss Olivia. Go ahead. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Jessica Rodriguez says, I mean, Trump did say he wants to put a golden dome above us. What if the
Yeah.
dome is already there and he just wants to take credit for it? And Karen Carpenter says, what are the connections with NASA, Space Force, and Palantir, and how used for or against humanity and the creation of the eighth sphere?
Oh yeah. Well, see, um, those are because again, Steiner's concept of the eighth sphere, and then if you bring it down to Earth, what does it look like? Right. So the eighth sphere is kind of humanity caught in thought, projecting in imagination, and it forms an actual sphere that somebody of a clairvoyant variety could see, which obviously is somewhere hovering. The way that Steiner draws it, I wish I had that drawing handy, is it's looped right around the Earth, and it seems to be kind of like looping into it. It's not around the whole thing; it's into one kind of aspect of it, and it's between us and the moon. And there's so many things to be said about the eighth sphere that I couldn't really do justice to that. But what I will say is that technologies that attempt to harness the human soul, the human mind, the human aspirations into a pre-designed format to feed something else, then they become harmonic by nature. And so we see a great deal of that. And what happens is when the way that the eighth sphere is described is very much like virtual reality or these other things that people, project themselves into fantasy wise. And the idea that the way that it's presented in anthroposophy is it splits you off, because when you're in the eighth sphere, you're in this imagination zone. And that zone, if you live there, basically, and if you're not living a full human life, you become subject to this other force. And the force itself is Ahriman, which, again, in like Faust and things like that, is the Mephistopheles character. It's Satan. And so there's a division in Steiner's work between Lucifer and Ahriman. And so you have two different forces operating there. One is trying to lure humanity off the world, and the other one is trying to entrench them into just full on materiality, cut them off completely from their spiritual realizations. So it's a long piece to describe it, but I think the battle there of the mystery schools that took place in the 19th century is a pretty good illustration of where we are, which is the scientific materialism that crept in ran the risk of people forgetting completely about their spiritual side, which is basically most of your identity. It's like spiritual, mental, physical, right? So if you lose your spirituality, you become then the subject of something else, and you're kind of a satellite for something else. So that's kind of the best snapshot I could give you for it. But it's obvious that people like Teal and Palantir and all that they're sucked in, and they're servants of that harmonic kind of force. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're up to the last question, X Series 206.
Give me two last.
Before we go, okay,
Mhm.
I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for the newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it's going to keep you in touch with some incredible announcements that we have coming up for you. DocuSeries, Craze in the Hot Zone, Pyramid X, JFK and the UFO File. It's all in there. Upcoming appearances, interviews, mind-blowing episodes. You're not going to miss it. stand up and be counted. Make sure you're in the newsletter list. Okay, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, let me start with this. So Scarlet Fire says Space Shuttle astronauts interview says that we do not have the tech to pass through the Van Allen belt. Many people believe that we never went to the moon. But that in the same time, we've got Ben Rich saying that we already have the technology to send ET home. How do you square the two?
No, we certainly went to the moon. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
But not using rocket technology, right?
No.
I mean, using something
No.
else.
This is the thing. This is in all of the reporting that we do around NASA, JFK, Blue Gemini. And so if you watch the X series, it's like a fuller answer, but I'll give you a real abbreviated one, which is basically, it's very clear that something happened in relation to the moon program. And it may have had to do with not so much getting there, but getting off of the moon. There was a special technology that was required for that. And I believe that technology came directly out of the redevelopment of the UFO file. That's why we were able to do it in that period of time. But there were lies about what was going on with the landing of the moon. The pictures that we were shown, there are a lot of problems with that. There's a weird thing too, if you think about it, as I mentioned at the top of the program, which is why hasn't another country gone to the moon with a manned program? But they never had the technology, and supposedly we lost the technology and we lost the ability to do it, and now we're just rediscovering.
Right, after spending millions of dollars?
Billions.
It's incredible.
Yes, excellent point. The other thing that's crucial to understand here is now we're talking about putting nuclear reactors on the moon. Obviously, we've been up there plotting this stuff out for 50 years. So the space program went black in the 70s. That's what happened with it. So it became a black project, like the continuity of government program. You just take those underground rules and flip it into space. But no, there were, and the thing about the Van Allen belt, it's true. If you spent serious amount of time in the Van Allen belt, they learned the effects of the radiation. But if you go through it, that's different, apparently. Now, I have not been into space. So I can't say that, they did all these things on the moon. But I'll tell you something. The weird part for me is not that they went to the moon. The weird part is, why did they stop? And why did they just pick it up again 53 years later?
What does your intuition tell you? Did
Well,
they stop?
Well, see,
my intuition just sitting here, and I'm really just talking about my gut. I'm like, oh no, there's all kinds of projects on the moon, and I think we're already on Mars. I think it's
undoubtedly. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of really great people think we've already been to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of things to consider there as well. But I've put, when you say, how does your intuition do it? I've done the shows and the documentaries. I've put my intuition into that research. And so I'd be interested in what you have to say about it. So if you think that we already went there, my own sense is, look, I want to tell you how this works too with humanity. Apparently, if you study the mystery schools, there's a secret about humanity as well, which is we all know what the other part of humanity knows. It's a kind of collective mind, oddly enough. There's a famous reading that Edgar Cayce gave when they were like, who's giving this discourse? Like, where are you getting the information on helping these people? And Cayce answers flat. He says, from the subconscious mind of the person asking for the reading. So the person in there already knows. He's getting the information from their subconscious. So all these subconscious minds are interlinked. So if there's a general somewhere who's working on a black project and he's found, a shipload of crashed aliens in a craft, then on some level, we all have that experience because we've tuned in on the level of humanity to have it. So ultimately, secrecy can't win, because humanity is ultimately connected in that sense. Now, that's the big picture type stuff. in the meantime, secrecy rules, right? But I guess that's my best shot on that. Miss Olivia, your last question, you're up.
Okay. All right. So Cece says, I'm going to bundle this again. Perhaps NASA is or has been studying under the oceans and the Antarctic. Michael Woods McCausland says, according to my father, who served in the South Pacific, they were encountering underwater air identified flying objects in 1942 and 43. And Deborah McAdoo says, Tim Burchett is the politician who recently said aliens are hiding at AUTEC, which you have reported about for years.
Yeah, well, I know that Burchett watches this show, and I've tried to. I gave Burchett's, Burchett Luna people indications about how to use that task force and stuff. I don't know if they ever did it or not, but unfortunately, see, the thing is with the task force and stuff, they just did one on September 10th, September 9th, actually. And, I mean, it didn't move the needle at all. So apparently either those people can't do anything about it or they don't know how. I believe that they want to, the people who run those committees, like Luna and Burchett, but they're not making any headway. And I've expressed very clearly the way that you can go about doing that and breaking through the secrecy. But it's not by going through the memories of George Knapp going to Russia in the 90s. That makes a good podcast. But that's my problem with a lot of what they do is they treat, they treat everything like a podcast now. So what they need to do is get some really hardcore people and put them before committees and ask them questions about the UFO file. So you get the top CIA person, the top NRO person, the top NGA person, and then you get some people who have been associated with these programs in the past. I recommended people like Bobby Inman, who is not only deeply knowledgeable about the JFK assassination, I mean, he's in his 90s, but he gave the award to George Joanides, after all, who was the person who we've, learned controlled the actions and set up the Oswald project, right? So creating the designated patsy. I think Strange Kismet. I think I have the picture of Joanides here. But, you can see that there's a great deal to do there. And, I mean, here's the thing. Here's the headline. Joanides from the CIA set up Oswald, throws out history books. We have to rewrite the history books because Oswald was set up patsy. So you change all of the curriculums now in the United States when it comes to studying history, and you throw out the fact that Oswald was the assassin, and you say CIA psychological top warfare, their top psychological warfare officer created the Oswald project, the whole idea. So, that's, you move it into some formidable function for the government. And you get those people on record and you get them to, give you that information. And in terms of saying, well, I want whistleblowers to have protection, that's good. But I'll tell you this, you also can't take on the people who are known counterintelligence people as whistleblowers. And you can't have people who are working for the government saying, I want to fight that government. If you have counterintelligence people, then they work for the government. So you have to ask them, are you in a counterintelligence role right now? So, you need a whole different approach with how they've been doing it. And so the task force was a really good idea. It's been pretty much a washout, but I think you could get somewhere with a real congressional committee. And I think there's a possibility there. So since you mentioned Burchett, yeah, he might have some idea that, he's watched this show, he's watched other shows. He has some idea about what's missing there in Congress, but he, as far as I can tell, with the task force, has not been able to pull off anything of substance. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but you can't have people like Mellon and others around. As a matter of fact, I think I'd subpoena Mellon and have him before that committee and ask him why were you controlling the actions of whistleblowers and telling them what they could do? You know, I mean, that's on the record. He admitted to doing it himself. Well, if you have a DOD billionaire who's trying to create a UFO threat and he's manipulating whistleblowers, I think Congress should talk to him, and not in a necessarily friendly fashion. Remember, and I get this a lot when I question people or things, you have to remember something. Real journalism, investigative journalism, is adversarial by its nature. It has to be. It's never personal. It can't be, or you get out of the business because you can't report properly. But it is adversarial, because if you want to go after a company that's committing corrupt actions, you're not going to go play tennis with the CEO. You've got to get to the bottom of the thing. So, you know, I don't need to, I have seen how those intelligence groups have manipulated the space. I've watched it up close. I've called it out. I've seen them try to marginalize the things that I've called out, or keep those whistleblowers from talking to me, and all these types of things. This is the way that it's gone. It's already on the record. Everybody already knows. The reason is because those people, like the Mellons and all the rest of it, they could never come on. They couldn't stand a minute on this show, because their entire agenda would crumble. Because I would say to them, you work for the government, you're creating a UFO threat. What's the object of you doing that? And if you're working for the government, how can you say that you're trying to get transparency from the government and that you're a whistleblower? So you have to get right to the core of the thing. Why aren't they telling you the truth? Why do you have this flimsy, incredibly flimsy UFO field loaded with people patting themselves on the back and for dealing with CIA people? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a pathetic field. It doesn't have to be. It's the most important subject, but it is surrounded and throttled by intelligence groups. And unless you change that, you'll never get any real answers there. Now, with the approach that we take on the UFO file, you'll get potent answers, because it doesn't serve anybody's purpose. There's no secret money bank or Netflix special or whatever. I'm giving you the facts that I've learned. And in some cases, those facts have come from the highest government officials you can imagine. So, this is how I think we need to approach it. And with that, Miss Olivia?
Did you answer the question about AUTEC and underwater UFOs enough?
Well, I'll tell you that I put AUTEC in our Craze in the Hot Zone documentary, which is available for free on this channel. But AUTEC is very important because they are the underwater Area 51, and they're on Andros Island. Guess where that is a stone's throw from?
Bimini.
Bimini. Excellent answer. And with that, Miss Olivia, that we will take your super chatters.
Okay. Hang on. By the way, just for a preview reference, what did you not get to tonight that you gave copies of and everything?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just wait. Next week, this is going to be something. And I have a special interview coming up this week as well.
Oh, that's right.
By the way, did you know there's a Masonic Lodge on the moon? Okay, this is science. On July 20th, 1969, 2 American astronauts landed on the moon in an area called the Sea of Tranquility. One of those brave men was Brother Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin. By the way, his mother's name was Moon.
Wow.
A member of Clear Lake Lodge 1417, Brother Buzz was authorized by the Grand Master of Texas to claim Masonic territorial jurisdiction for Grand Lodge of Texas on the moon. Buzz Aldrin conducted the consecration of the first Masonic Lodge on the moon, thus securing the right to open a branch. The Grand Provincial Moon Lodge, the landing of the lunar module, had been made in the Sea of Tranquility. Therefore, the new lodge received the name Tranquility Lodge and got the number 2000. Where's the 33 that's associated with everything else in NASA? The astronauts did not doubt that by 2000 there would be permanent lunar base. Yeah, good luck with that. Given how many Freemasons there were in NASA's astronauts squad, it was quite logical to open a special lodge for them.
You know, if the moon landing was faked, why would they bother doing that?
Interesting. Yeah, excellent point. Obviously, there's some chicanery around the moon landings, but they certainly got themselves up there. Uh, all right, it's Europe.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Eurythmia's Fun, Thomas Ball, Jessica Rodriguez, Jake, Empire of Light, Tim Houston, Ray Story, Sick of the BS, Descat Brock, Thomas M., Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Amarillo Gunrunners, Julie Sunshine 333, Seattle Metaphysical Library, Ice Rain J, Black Tie, David Lower Dash, Vulcanelli, The Secret Spaceship, W. Ross, Deborah McAdoo, and Terry Doherty, Natalia Christine Escudero, Helena Wilcock, Short Order Cook 1, Eurythmia's Fun, and Jimmy Lyle Kennemer. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Oh, that's fantastic. We really appreciate your support and for having such a great crowd with us here tonight. It's to all our subscribers, you really help us to do the work that we do, and we couldn't do it without you. So thanks again for your support. I'll do a couple of shout outs while I have you here. And Humphrey Gooch, Matt Stu, Porky Goss. Failure is not an option. I like that. It's really true. Yeah, it's interesting that I was reading some of Kennedy's statements around the moon in private, and he was saying we can't have any half measures. Either you go all the way or go home. And I think it's kind of a good approach. Corey Anderson, thank you, sir. It's great to see you out there. Positive Planet. You said Bosley was out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Walter Bosley, of course. Good to see you. We're going to have Bosley back on the show. The rumors that DJ is Hungarian ET are almost completely exaggerated. This Don New Way.
I was looking for it, but the picture, the drawing, the rendition of the Granada spaceship, people are saying look like a Delshau craft.
That's true.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's odd. Really, really strange. And an Ankh in the middle. Come on. Let's see. Who else we got there? Synthetic Nature. Glass Darkly. Thank you very much for being here. Blue Man 2012. Bravo, DJ and Olivia. Is that Blue Man, like Blue Man Group? Oh my God. Lord of Mercy. Clear Tchaikovsky, Poland. Hey, it's great to have Poland out there in the audience. Very nice to have you with us. And let's see. Matt Stew. Thank you, sir. Excellent. Esther Taylor. Roy Story, thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Ray, for being there. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. And Tina Boric. Fantastic to see you out there. Adam Hugel, great show as usual. Thank you. Whew, what an ideas room out there tonight. The questions were off the charts and right in line with the show, which always makes it the best show of all. And Miss Olivia, bravo, excellent job as well. We will be back with you next week. Was that Shamanist Anam Kara? Thank you so much, DJ and Olivia. Stay strong, free, and feel the love. Great to see you out there. Nice work, dynamic duo. Don Neway, yes, sir. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer. It's good to see you out there, Jimmy. Love, empathetic, smart people, addiction. Karen Carpenter, guard your humanity. That's a great one. Thanks for the show, David Lower Dash. And with that, everyone, we will see you all next week. We have some very exciting interviews coming up for you, some very interesting things coming out of very interesting places, because this one came out of left field, but as soon as I heard about it, I was on it. So keep your fingers crossed, because I should have it for you next week. And this is something else. And we also will have a fantastic episode coming up. We're working right now on that whole piece around JFK and the UFO file. There's a very interesting piece around that relating to a very recent UFO case. So a good deal of that will be coming forward in the JFK UFO file docuseries. And we will see you all next week, Miss Olivia.
I have a message from Spirit. every night before the show, I do a little prayer, and I got a very clear message from Spirit that said, keep the vibe cool, keep the enthusiasm high. And I think it was good for tonight, and it's just good going forward. You can't go wrong with that advice.
Wow, that's fantastic. As always, learned a lot. Thank you, Heather. It's great to see you out there. We will see you all next week. And it says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
Never really ends. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there can be again. We'll see you all next week, everyone. Until then, keep your X radar primed and sleep tight. We'll see you all again very soon.
God bless everybody.